us in the social networks,
para la Escuela de
for
Historia,
the School of
luego
History,
para la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Costa
for
Rica,
the School of Social Sciences of
la
Costa Rica,
Escuela de Historia de esta universidad
and
y
the
la
School of History
Federación
of
de
this
África y del Caribe.
university, and the
Es un
Catholic
honor
and
poder
the
contar hoy
Chair of Studies of Africa
con
and the Caribbean. It's an honor to be able to have
inicio de este
this
simposio,
beginning of this
con la
symposium
presencia
today
de tan
with the
distinguidas
presence of
personas
so many distinguished
del
people
mundo académico.
from around the
El
academic
simposio
world.
del otro bicentenario, la
The
abolición de la
symposium of the other
esclavitud en
bicentennial, the abolition of
Centroamérica,
slavery in
trayectorias
Centroamerica, Atlantic
que se desarrollará
transitions and
hoy viernes y
afrodescendants,
mañana
that will
sábado
be developed
24
today,
por estos
Friday and tomorrow Saturday.
Sin más, voy a presentar a las
Without
personas
further
que van
ado, I will
a
present the people that are
las palabras
going to give the
de
opening
inicio.
remarks.
Primeramente presentar a
First of all, I
la
would like to
señora
present
decana, la
Ms.
doctora Isabel Avendaño,
Dean, Ms. Isabel Avendaño
eh,
Flores,
que es, bueno, decana de la
who
Facultad
is
de
the Dean
Ciencias
of the
Sociales de
Faculty of
esta
Social
universidad de la
Sciences, and
Universidad
she
de
is an
Costa Rica,
academic from the
directora del
University
Centro
of
de
Costa Rica. She
Geografía
was
de la
the
Universidad
director
de
of
Costa Rica,
the School of Geography of
realizó
the University of
estudios de
Costa Rica. She
doctorado en
studied
el Centro
postgrad
Latinoamericano de
studies in
Demografía
the Central
de la
American
Comisión Económica para
Commission
América
for the
Latina y
Economic Commission for
Centroamérica.
Latin America in
Además,
Santiago,
tiene un
Chile,
doctorado en estudios de la
and she has a
educación y la
PhD
cultura.
in the
Su
studies of
trabajo de tesis
society and the
titulado
culture, with her
Inmigrantes
thesis
Territoriales en la ciudad de San
named
José, en Costa Rica, en
Immigrant
2007, y ha
Territorials in the
trabajado
city of
en
San Jose in
multitud de
2007.
temas
And she has worked in
relacionados
multiple
con la
issues
geografía
related to
urbana y económica,
urban
así como los
cartography,
estudios relacionados con
as well as with the studies that are related to the
Entonces,
migration. So,
para las palabras de bienvenida,
for
le doy
her
el paso
welcoming
a
remarks, I
la
give the floor
doctora
now
Isabel.
to Dr.
Muchas
Isabel
gracias por
Avendaño
esta mañana.
this morning.
Quisiera interrumpir un segundito, perdón,
I would like to take,
para los colegas, el tema
for
del
the
idioma,
colleagues, the topic of
por
language.
favor,
Please,
hay un ícono.
there's a little icon
Hay
at the
un
bottom of the
icono
screen.
en la parte
Yes, there is an
inferior,
icon at the bottom of the
derecha,
screen
donde ustedes
that
pueden
is sort of like a
seleccionar
globe where
el
you can
idioma
select
de preferencia
the
para
language of your
escuchar
choice to be able
la
to listen
conferencia.
to this
Bueno, en este
conference.
caso tenemos
In this case, we
servicio
have
traductor para
the interpretation
el idioma
services
inglés
for
y
the language,
español.
languages English and Spanish.
Listen to us. You will click at the bottom, you will see y buscar el idioma de su preferencia.
And look for
El
this.
problema es que la gente está oyendo en
Sí,
español.
es que se lo está haciendo en inglés.
Okay.
She was doing it in English.
No
Okay.
están conectados a la traducción.
Okay, so we have the translation services. Please connect to the language of your choice. There is a button at the bottom of the screen.
En el inferior derecho.
At the bottom right hand, there is an icon that says
who wish to listen to
para-
these presentations in English or French, I'm guessing. There is a button on the bottom left or right side of your screen where you can switch the language. You can also chat me in case you're not finding it, and I will assist you.
También hay dos transmisiones en vivo en Facebook y en YouTube, cada una
we also have two live transmissions in Facebook and YouTube, each one in the corresponding languages. Thank you.
Entonces,
so with that,
no sé
once
si
again,
continuamos con
shall we continue with the agenda,
y de nuevo, le
following the
damos
protocol? And
el
once again,
agradecimiento a la señora
we
decana
thank
que nos ha
the
considerado
Madame Dean, who has
acompañarnos
taken time
esta mañana
to
y
accompany us this
le
morning.
damos el espacio para
So we give the floor so that she can give her opening remarks. Mrs. Isabel Avendaño Flores. Thank you very much. Very good mornings. It is for me an honor to be here this morning in this very important event. I am going to try to be as precise and concise as possible so as to recover a little bit of the, or contribute a little bit to expedite the time. So a very warm greeting to Dr. Rina Cáceres, educator, academic, retired from the University of Costa Rica, to Professor Wilson Arroyo, who has preceded me with some opening remarks. He spent too much time in my presentation, which was not worthwhile, but because this is to work, and Dr. Miriam Cojias, the director of the International Center for Research regarding Slavery and Post-Slavery from France, who will further on also be presented. It is a pleasure to be with such distinguished colleagues, but also it is a pleasure to be this morning for me saying these opening remarks. It is a pleasure for the School of History and the Center for Studies of Africa and the Caribbean, the Political Sciences, and the Dean of Social Sciences as a part of this very important project. To this, we also want to add that the project of social action, denominated in recognition of the history and the cultural heritage of the Caribbean, Costa Rican Caribbean. For these institutions of the University of Costa Rica, it is a pleasure for us to be here this morning, and we give all of you not only a warm greeting, but also a very warm hug. This at a distance. This event has a very important concept for us, and it is the 50th anniversary of the Social Sciences faculty, but it is also carried out in the framework of the commemoration of three processes, very important processes, I would say. The bicentennial of the abolition of the slavery in Central America, the 30 years of the creation of the UNESCO program, Routes of the enslaved peoples, the liberty and patrimony, breaking the silence regarding the slavery, with whom we have shared and learned very much from the word and the actions and the cathedra, and the chair from Dr. Rina Cáceres, and also in commemoration of the Afrodescendents decade from 2015 to 2024. I would like to very in a general overview to share looking at the program that you shared, just a few words in the sense that this year we celebrate 200 years of the abolition of the slavery, 1824 to 2024, in all throughout Central America. That covered Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Later on, Belize and Panama would have to wait for this abolition of the slavery until 1833 and 1851. It is not until 1851 that there was really Central America in its more geographical sense was added to the countries that had abolished the slavery, to this very important process of abolition of the slavery. The program also says that contrary to the celebrations regarding the bicentennial of the signing of the Act of Independence, this commemoration has not had the governmental official recognition, and nor the attention of the means of communication of the media. And it also tells us that for more than 300 years in our societies, we use the physical violence, the torture, the forced displacement, the separation of the family nucleus, and the legislation that was used to justify the slavery of people, of Afro-descendant people and their descendants. Also, to exclude from the political power and different institutions free Afro-descendants who did not go through slavery, in spite of the fact that they are constituted in many cities, more than 1/3 of the population. The program also tells us that the goal of this symposium, in this anniversary of the summit of the UNESCO, is to break the silence regarding the history of slavery. It is to contribute to analyze the strategies that hundreds of men and women who from very early times fought for freedom. Well, I want to tell you that, and I want to reaffirm and I want to ratify that for me, it is very important that from the University of Costa Rica, effectively,
contribuyamos a romper ese
we
silencio.
contribute to break the silence.
Siéntanse, por favor, a todas las
Please feel,
personas,
all the people,
investigadoras,
researchers,
muy
who are participating in this,
espacio.
to feel, I invite you to feel very much welcome to this space. We give you really a very warm hug at a distance. And we hope that these couple of days will be very productive for the exchange, for the updating, for breaking the silence, but also with the topics of alleged centrality and the borders of the state, nation states, to be able to study and go deeper into configurations of and new reconfigurations, both geographic as well as territorial, historical, cartographic reorganizations of this puzzles, so that they might take a new insights, both for the region, Central American region, the Caribbean, Spain, and for the Atlantic coastline of Africa. And I'm very happy with this experience of sharing innovative knowledge, for reviewing, for the exchange of knowledge, that this scientific network of very high level that has been put together in sight of the slavery might be consolidated and strengthened, and that this space might allow us a little bit to reflect regarding inhumane practices that took place in the past, but that nowadays it seems that they have not been eradicated completely. And these are practices, predator practices, inhumane in its more blunt and extended sense. It seems to me that this space is going to be fundamental to be able to understand how the values of freedom have been built, justice, equalness, human rights in the modern societies. And we hope that this will also help us understand the challenges that exist for equalness and to eradicate the ways of oppression and discrimination. I would like to say and give you
desearles lo mejor en estos 2 días de intercambios.
In closing, to wish you the best for these 2 days of exchange, at a moment that for us is something that is very important, where the public universities are being hit. And with that, with a budget restriction that is choking us, that is oppressing us, in such a way that
son sumamente importantes de la universidad pública. Así que yo les
developing these
deseo
spaces is something that is very important for the public opinion. So I wish you the best from the bottom of my heart. And may all of you have a very good morning, and thank you very much for allowing me to make my opening remarks.
Muchas gracias, Isabel.
Thank you very much, Ms. Isabel. It is an honor and it's an appreciation for all the logistic support that is provided by the Deanhood of Social Sciences to this summit. We continue then with all the guests that we have. We would like to present Dr. Miriam Cotter. She is the director of the National Center of Investigation of Slavery of France. She is also a historian regarding the slavery in the Caribbean, director of the National Center for Scientific Research of the University of the West Indies in Guyana, and she leads the National Center for the research on slavery, and she has carried out several research, some of them regarding gender and censorship in the West Indies from 1948 to 85, and the colonial slavery was a national history, a publication in the magazine of modern history and contemporary history. So without further ado, I'm thanking her for her company in this space. I give the floor to Ms. Miriam Colitas. Welcome. Kotler.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, you could hear me. Okay. Good morning to all of you. Well, it's a great honor to be invited to speak at this symposium organized to mark the 30th anniversary of UNESCO program, Roots of the Enslaved People, Resistance, Freedom, and Heritage. And I'd like to thank Professor Rina Cáceres in particular and the University of Costa Rica for organizing this event. August 23rd is a UNESCO International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. And in this year, it has a special echo as it matches with the 220th anniversary of Haiti independence. It is also the completion of the United Nations Decade of Afrodescendants, 2015-2024. They didn't already talk about that. And last but not least, it is the bicentennial of the abolition of slavery in Central America. I'm very delighted to be able to speak virtually here in Costa Rica or in each point of the speakers' stand, which has such Costa Rica, which has such a special situation when it comes to the issue of slavery, because its history and its position between North America and South America and between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, just in front of the Caribbean island where I come from. Costa Rica is really unification of world, a way of, is a place of unifying question on slavery in the past and in the present, I will say. Well, since the foundation of this program in 1994, many projects have emerged in which UNESCO can be truly proud. Breaking the silence on the subject of slavery has provided a major impulse by opening up a field of opportunities that has been seized by civil societies, actors, associations, citizens, as well as by national institutions, promotion of place of remembrance, construction of memorials, reconnection of cultural practice, creation of archives, curricula, and educational programs. These various activities have been conducted at an international and national levels by each of these organizations with conviction, enthusiasm, and creativity. And I am very proud to be the president of the International Scientific Committee of the UNESCO program. The 30th anniversary of the Roots of Enslaved People program represents a milestone and is unfortunately also concomitant with the most tragic events experienced by people identified as Black. It brings slavery and its damaging repercussion back to the center of politics, along with new modalities for thinking about the collective. While the first phase of the program established the resistance, creativity, and active participation of enslaved people in world history, another phase is now being opened up based on more recent political events. They are initiating two new projects, two new phase perspectives in my view. First, Slavery has established long-lasting categories of classification in which civil status and origin have constructed the notion of race, which has not been abolished by the formal abolition of slavery. These categories have persisted and have crystallized into representation that are stigmatizing and depreciating of African population or population of African descent, all of which are contained with racism. The deconstruction of these representations, including their gender dimension, should be on the agenda of the fight against racism in every country. While race does not exist at the biological level, it remains an experience at the social and political level. Second, reparation for slavery is imperative, as it is a strong social need arising from the consequences of racism and social and economic inequalities. In all the various meaning of the term reparation, raising the questions allows us to re-establish justice for a more egalitarian world. It allows society not to lose the vital and innovative strengths of people whose history is rooted in slavery by breaking down the barriers that keep them from participating in the running of their societies according to their own skill. We'll still have a lot of work ahead of us. We need to tackle them if we want to build a shared humanity, a universalism that respects all those involved. I would like to thank you for your attention and wish you every success in your work. And I will finish by this sentence: honor and respect for our ancestors who suffered slavery. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, doctora. Un honor contar con su presencia y muchas gracias por esas inspiradoras palabras. Continuamos ahora con la doctora Rina Cáceres, que tiene un papel protagónico en todo el trabajo que está detrás de esta actividad. La doctora Rina Cáceres es profesora emérita de la Escuela de Historia de la Universidad de Costa Rica. Disculpen, es que se está escuchando la traducción. Entonces, voy a quitarlo. Disculpe. Disculpen. Bueno, la doctora Rina Cáceres.
Dr. Rina Cáceres is a professor emeritus of the University of History, of the School of History of the University of Costa Rica. She is a founder, a member of the Center of Studies of Africa and the Caribbean. She is the chair of the Scientific Council of the UNESCO program, Routes. She is a member, sorry, of the program of the UNESCO, Routes of these Enslaved Peoples, Heritage and Patrimony. Her work has been pioneering regarding the African and Afro-descendant population in the Central American region, and she's here in her role as compiler of the book of Routes of Slavery of Africa and Latin America. That was a motive for her to reach the award, the Haute Chateauria Award for National Literacy in Costa Rica. So without further ado, very honored to have the presence of Ms. Rina Cáceres and of all her work. And without any other delay, I give her the floor now so that she can give her opening remarks. Thank you very much for your kind words. And I would like to thank very deeply our colleagues, Isabel Avendaño and Miriam for being present in this, because I know that you have very tight schedules these days. Also to our colleagues, a very warm greeting to our colleagues from Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Mexico, and other parts of the world in general that are communicating with us today here. As it has been mentioned before, the goal and the purpose of the symposium is to analyze and visualize the strategies of hundreds of men and women that from very early times fought for their freedom. The gaps in the memory and the historical explanation have been a culture where we have grown in the exclusion, which are the base of the racial profiling that many people face nowadays, and which are the president of the council, Dr. Kotlis, mentioned. From our university, we think that this history competes to all of us as part of the social tissue. In this logic, we understand the words of the then director of the system of the United Nations in Panama, Mr. Robinson, who said, how do we make public policies that are inclusive if we don't know what happened before? If we don't know how our situations were divided, our societies were divided, how do we make our vehicles more inclusive, and we don't let go through the doors of the history the lives of hundreds of men and women that built our nations, as well as the way in which that system operated. In these 2 days, we hope that we can contribute to respond at least to part of those questions. In total, as mentioned by the Madam Dean, this group and this symposium has a transatlantic point of view that goes beyond the borders of the state nations, precisely to see that transversality that has affected the Afro-descendant world. Here we are coming together a group of researchers with a long history of historical research with primary sources that together we have covered a whole collection of historical documents, colonial documents, different geographical and historical moments of the Central American, Caribbean, Spain, and African West Coast, Atlantic coast. And we hope that in these next few days, we might be able to respond to some of the questions that we still have, and that we might be able to contribute somehow to the progress of the knowledge of our past. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Cáceres. Thank you very much for your kind words and for opening up with this activity. With this, we would be finishing the introductory part of the activity, and we would give the floor now to Dr. José Hernandez Montedoca, who is the coordinator of the first panel for this symposium. Thank you very much for being with us. And if you allow me, Wilson, a small observation of order for the 2 days that we're going to be working together. Let's try to respect a little bit the order. We have 20 minutes for each one of the presentations, and we have another 20 minutes for questions, comments, or reflections within the panelist group. We have a very tight agenda. We know we all have very busy lives, but let's try to stay within that and bind to the moderators, table moderators, and we ask them to be a little persistent in reminding us when we are 5 minutes short of finishing with our time. Okay? Today, I finished with my conclusion, the presentation of the book, the new book of Robin Williamson, went with Dr. Wilson Melendez that are present here. It is a very important issue, and let's pay attention to the job that we are going to face. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Rina. So we will continue And now I present to you Dr. Jose Fernandez Montes de Oca, who is going to be the host of the first panel for the symposium. Thank you very much to all of you who are accompanying us from many different places, geographic places throughout the world. We hope that you enjoy the symposium.
Hello, good morning. Mic check. Can you folks hear me? Great. Very well. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen who are attending to this meeting and this session on Zoom. Those of you that can listen to us via the Facebook page of Social Sciences and our YouTube channel. For me, it's a great honor to be here in this session. I'll try and be brief so that we can stay within our allotted time. My name is Fernandez. I am a professor, investigator of the studies on Africa and the Caribbean. And this morning, we're starting with the first table, which is resistance and African societies. We have three panelists for which I will do a small introduction. First up, we have Dr. Esteban Alfaro Salas, who is a historian and a professor in the School of in the University of London in the United Kingdom. He holds a bachelor degree from the UCR, University of Costa Rica, and he got his master's from the Notre Dame and a postdoctoral studies in the agrarian studies from Yale. His research study is centered in Central and Western Africa societies and the impact of the slave trade. His work is focused on freedom, autonomy, creation of shelters, racial thinking, and early colonialism in Angola. Esteban has done some research studies in Angola, Portugal, United States, and his publications include contributions to the Book of African Women in the Atlantic World, Ability of 1980, and the Oxford Research Encyclopedia. Second place, we have Dr. Papa Sherif Bertrand, who is a professor of history of Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal. He is a doctor. He has a PhD. He got his PhD from the Naval University in Quebec, Canada, and the European University in South Bretagne in France. His research study is centered on the memory of the slave trade in the Western African and Atlantic watershed. And his contribution is mostly on the contribution of historical knowledge and the peace building process, conflict resolution, and human rights in Africa. And last but not least, of course, we have a presentation by Professor Paul Lovely. Paul is an emeritus professor in New York University of Canada. He is a pioneer in the research studies of the new approach on the history of slavery in Western Africa in the diasporic communities, and he played a very, very important role in showing us the interconnectedness between the different systems of slavery in Africa, the Atlantic, and Islamic world in the modern history. He is the founder director of the Henry Bowman Institute and has also been a member of the International Committee on the Project of the Slave Trade Routes by UNESCO. He is author of over 40 books, over 100 papers that I cannot start to list here because that would take us too long. But welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your presence here. We're going to start with Dr. Alfaro, who is going to talk about refuge, autonomy, and freedom resisting slavery in Quilengues, Angola, 1790-1860. Please go right ahead, Doctor. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jose Andres. It is a true honor to share with this great group of well-respected researchers. Usually in Central America, when we talk about resistance to slavery of African people, we talk about experiences of those who already lived in different parts of the Americas. In the same way, when we're talking about freedom or abolition, but actually about life of African people who were still slaves, we tend to think that about those who had already been displaced forcefully to American territories, American continent territories, but we must not forget that slavery started in Africa and the efforts of free people to ensure their freedom was actually part of an everyday struggle in their places of origin. Thinking about abolition, I would like to talk about two different aspects in the search for freedom. One are the efforts by individuals to free themselves or try and abstain from becoming slaves. And then the efforts by the Central Western African states to oppose the Portuguese expansion. For those states to preserve their autonomy was a way to not giving in to the slave trade that would feed the Atlantic routes, and that was actually encouraged by foreigners in Western Africa. People living in chiefdoms in Quilengues, which is where I am going to focus, give light to these very particular processes because these were populational centers due to their very high trade activity as well as because of their efforts to maintain their autonomy and freedom. At the same time, Central Western Africa was absolutely key in the development of the Western Hemisphere because that was the origin of over 12.5 million people that were deported to the Americas, and Central America was not an exception. Let me share my screen very briefly to show you all the location of Quilengues in Central Western Africa.
¿Consiguen ver, sí?
Are you folks able to see my screen? Yes, yes, we can. Perfect.
Entonces, en el recuadro pequeño es
So in the small
gris
peep,
oscuro está la silueta
in dark
del
gray,
actual
you can
Estado
see
Nación de
the
Angola,
silhouette
puesto en el
of
siglo XIX.
Angola,
La primera mitad
which of course
no
in the
es
first
exactamente
half
así,
of the
pero
19th
después de
century
leer
did
la
not look
versión
like
del
this,
recuadro pequeño,
but it can actually
el punto
give us an idea.
referencia es
The
Benguela
point of
en la costa
reference is
atlántica, que
Benguela
son
in
los
the
2 puntos que
Atlantic
les estoy
coast,
señalando,
which is
que
here,
fue
which I'm
fundado
showing right now,
posiblemente
which was
1617, es decir,
founded
este es
by the
una
Portuguese
historia
in
que combina sociedades
1617. So
precoloniales
this
con una
is a
historia de
history with
expansión colonial,
pre-colonial
y Quilengue está
societies
más al
with
sur,
this
hacia el sur,
history of
no es
colonial
muy costado,
expansion, and Quilengues,
como
which
lo
is a little
pueden ver,
bit to the south.
pero sí
As you
fue
can see
es lo que
here,
quiero destacar por las razones que
this is the
mencioné.
one that I want to talk about, Quilengues.
Muy bien.
Very well.
Entonces voy a comenzar con una historia.
So allow
En
me to start with
1827,
a story.
Catarina,
In
una mujer
1827,
esclavizada de Loma
Catarina,
Grande, y su hija
enslaved woman
Cambiango
from Loma Grande, and her
desaparecieron del
son
radar del
Cambiango
esclavista
disappeared from the
que
radar of
tomaba
the
la propiedad sobre
slaves
ellos.
that
La
claimed
huida
property over
sucedió
them.
cuando Catarina
The
y
escape
Cambiango
happened when
iban de
Catarina
camino
and
hacia
Cambiango were
Quilengues,
on their way to
posiblemente con
Quilengues,
el propósito de
possibly
comerciar
with the purpose
yuca,
of
maíz
trading
o incluso textiles
tapioca,
como era
corn,
común
and
en
even
esa ruta.
textile as it
No
was
era
common
raro que
in that
personas
route back then. It
esclavizadas
wasn't
fueran
strange
enviadas a
that
dejar o traer
enslaved
productos
people
entre
were
Quilengues y
sent
Hombre Grande.
to deliver or
Estos sitios
bring
eran
back
dos de los
products from
mayores
between
centros
Quilengue and
comerciales
Hombre
igual que
Grande.
Benguela,
These
pues,
were
que era el
two
puerto
of the
y
main
el
things, which
asentamiento
was the
portugués en la
port
costa
and
atlántica.
the Portuguese
La
settlement in the
transhumancia, la
Atlantic coast.
ganadería in
The
situ y la
transformance, the
agricultura eran actividades
on-site
centrales tanto en Quilengues como en
livestock,
Hombre
and the
Grande,
agriculture
y
were
continúan
key
siendo.
activities in both
La abundancia de
places, and
agua
continues to
en
be
las orillas
the
del río
abundance of
Porolo
water
que
at the margins of River Cuporolo and the River Cunele that went through Quilengues would allow to face the droughts that would predominate in the Western African territory in drought periods of over 3 years. The caravans were a frequent scenario of enslaved people throughout the region. Based also, it happens with Livolo, Ingulungu, High Ingulungu, which were situated along the coast of França River. This was a way of self-attained freedom to avoid the violence by slavers, as well as people who would try to capture those who would free themselves. Catalina and Camiango found shelter in Kubungu. Kimbanda means healing man or healing person. It was a powerful ability and a prestigious skill in many societies in Central Western. Catarina and Kimbanda were actually old friends, or Kimbanda just decided to open the doors of his house to this woman and her son. The Kimbandas offered a safe place for refuge because they actually counted with the protection of the local chiefs of these autonomous societies. That was the case in the cases such as Quilengue. The Kimbandas would mobilize political and spiritual power, and they were part of the decision-making processes, which created ideal conditions for the security of those that were searching for a safe place. Therefore, people of influence like Kimbandas could have ulterior motives to offer a helping hand to the refugees. It could be just solidarity, but it could also be the self-preservation interest in order to add refugees to the autonomous groups and become a bigger people. In another case of self-liberation, a young woman brought to Quilengue looking for refuge. The source of information in that case, which was Sylvester presented to the colonial state of Quimbela, requesting the authorities to allow him to capture this young woman, relates very specifically, quote unquote, the young woman found protection with her mother in Quilengues. In other words, the family of this young woman was in Quilengues, and she was able to escape Sylvester to re-encounter with her mom. They did not recount her name or her age in the chronicle, nor their mothers, but the anonymity was a frequent practice due to the fact that the Portuguese would consider persons as objects and somebody else's possessions and not persons themselves. It was not clear if the young woman's mother was free or enslaved, but the characteristics usually showed that this was an illegal enslavery case of a person who had been born free. The act of defunction next year in 1829 recounts that her profession had been as a transporter of societies between Quilengues and they would do by foot. They would carry stuff on their shoulders in caravans with few or hundreds of other transporters. The caravans would include free peoples, intermediaries, women, children, men, all enslaved. Due to the constant movement between the different points of the regions, the caravans would facilitate the capture of different persons like this young woman, and this capturing of persons and was actually commonplace. In the 17th century, in slavery practice was actually imprisonment in wars hosted by the Portuguese authorities in the first 19th century, individual rapture had actually claimed the same level of preponderance due to the expansion of violence and civil wars. In the case of Catarina and Candiango, the same as the young women in Quilengues who were willing to travel 250 kilometers by foot to ensure their security suggests that they would know the legal precepts to actually challenge slavery. The first precept was that when a person was born free of free parents, they would acquire the right of the original freedom, which was the right to remain free in their lifetime. Nevertheless, illegal slavery actually went in detriment of many people. It is some of the most renowned cases of people who reclaimed their originals was Leonor de Carvalho Fonseca, a text by Mariana Candide, who is going to be speaking tomorrow. The legal request of Doña Leonor, freedom request, presented to get to the main administrative events in Angola, Rwanda, and the ability to navigate the colonial society with her knowledge of Portuguese, Christianity, and the previously established links with the colonial authority. Her freedom was redeemed after many attempts and conversations with the Catholic authorities. But these were far from being the best conditions for most of the victims of illegal slavery. The second precept that enslaved people could recur to in the regulation of their local societies is Chimbika or Tumbika. This would consist in the possibility for an enslaved person to seek shelter away from those who would claim possession over them with the purpose of having a better life. Gadu Magyar, from a Hungarian colonialist who was in Wanwapo, inside of Benguela for the 30 years, narrated how Tumbika worked in the local regulations. The person seeking shelter would kill an animal that would belong to the person who would provide shelter. It could be a sheep or a goat. By slaying the animal, the person claiming property had to respond or to answer for the slaying of the animal and would be in debt with the owner of that. As a consequence, the enslaved person would be deeded to the owner of the animal, who would become the new owner. So the function was not to actually question the Portuguese regulation, the status of being enslaved. For the refugees, it was more important to use the local regulation and using Timbika to have a better quality of life. The history in Central Western Africa has talked about quilombos as a way of resisting slavery. These places, these sites were asylum given sites and would bring protection for the self-liberated persons. Quilombo has their origins in different societies north of the Kwanza River, Luanda, and on the delta of the Kwanza River in the Atlantic was the largest and most feared asylum state by the Portuguese. Cases like Tumbika, like Catarina and Candiango, and the request based on the right of original freedom, like the young woman in Quilembe, happened within colonial jurisdiction, not outside. Instead of evading the colonial laws away from Portuguese influence territories, this would question the logic of positioning regarding enslaved person and that did not conceive the possibility of self-liberation or refuge, and was in these territories under colonial jurisdiction to where most of the people were deported from the Atlantic slave trade. Free and slave people transited between the Portuguese colonial legal system and the local system in between 1575, the foundation of Luanda by the Portuguese, and the abolition of the slave trade in Angola in 1875. In Quilengues, for example, there was a combination of jurisdictions that included a settlement, a colonial settlement, with a military presence by the Portuguese, various chiefdoms that would pay tribute to the Portuguese state, and some completely autonomous states. The Portuguese censuses would identify Quilengues as the place with the largest number, 50, and the largest proportion, 25%, of fiefdoms that were subject to Bengala. Excuse me, doctor. It's been 15 minutes. You got 5 minutes left. The colonial state would impose a tax. It was a taxing system that the Portuguese had appropriated from the Indembo, in which the lesser states would pay the greater states in form of harvest, minerals, or even labor. Nevertheless, the importance of agriculture and trade in Quilengues reveals how these societies would use the tribute to the colonial state to limit the Portuguese colonial expansion in their territories during this period. Jan Pancina identified the potential of the Quilengues based on the stories of 1680, 1681 of Antonio Cadernega, a Portuguese colonialist, shows how the rebels to the colonization and slavery around Ponce River came from the Quilengues to the south and would form a corridor called Yaga in the central Western Africa. That was the name that Portuguese would give to societies that would resist to their subordination.
Despite the
individual and collective ways of resistance to slavery and the control of the Portuguese, the colonial expansion did not stop during this time, and it did affect the demographic and the gender composition of the local population. The closer there was to a local settlement, bigger was the percentage of people who would be enslaved, mostly women. Women would be part of the greatest part of those that worked the land, which was very commonplace in the Central Western African societies. Indeed, this only came to accentuate this reality because the deported people were men. Therefore, most of who would stay were women. The trend varies in this period, but it tends to be the norm. So, the colonial expansion in Africa, in the Central Western Africa part, did not start with the Conference of Beliers of 1884 and 1885, as we usually tend to interpret based on some textbooks, but it started with the foundation of the first Portuguese settlements in Luambangela in the 16th and 17th century. In that period of time, we find a parallelism with the experience in the Americas. The colonial territory control, as well as resources and populations, progressed with the Atlantic slave trade that had been consolidated for the 17th century. Paradoxically, the first half of the 19th century was at the same time the abolition, but also the largest amount of numbers of the Atlantic slave trade, mostly women and children in these areas. Hundreds of cases like Catarina, Candiango, and the young woman of Quilengues allows us to see the experiences of local people beyond the anonymity of numbers. Their efforts to preserve their freedom is part of the social resistance to slavery in the abolitionist era, even Their voices were not mentioned in the abolitionist discussions that happened in the European parliaments. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Esteban.
Thank you very much, Esteban, for your presentation. Now we have Dr. Pape Sherif Bertrand Vassini, who is going to talk about different history of the Hula Pupila fight in the Atlantic process from the 18th century. Dr. Bertrand, you have 20 minutes as of now. I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left. Thank you, sir.
You are mute.
Doctor, you're muted, sir.
Hello.
We can hear you now. Thank you.
Hear me now? Okay, thank you. Okay, I think I will be able to share my screen because I'm going to talk about a shrine and the place of the shrine in the Atlantic slave trade. And the region I will be interested is between, I don't know whether you know Senegal, and it's between the Gambia. So I'm using a work by and a study done by the OSTOM, Office of Research. I mean, it's now Israel, they call it Israel. And I'm using their data or their illustration. So the region I'm interested is between Casamance, between the Gambia and Guinea-Bissau. And the people we are going to be interested are those, this is from the 15th century and 16th century. And when the Portuguese came on the coast,
I can't hear anything.
Me neither.
Sí, estamos teniendo problemas con, me parece que es el internet del doctor
I
Bertrand.
think Dr. Bertrand is having problems with his internet connection. I think he just fell off. Is he back? Let me double check.
Que lo perdimos.
I just told them we lost him.
Okay, vamos a darle unos minutos a ver si
Let's just give him a couple of minutes just to make sure. Let's see if he can hear us.
Dr. Bertrand, are you here? Can you hear us?
Dr. Bertrand, can you hear us?
Estoy llamándolo, pero tampoco me contesta. No sé si
I am calling him, but he's not picking up.
pasamos a la siguiente presentación y le
Should we
damos-
go on to the next presentation and give him? I can see he's still connected, but
No sé si se le fue un poco
I don't know.
el internet.
I don't know. Maybe his internet connection is not working so well.
Pasamos a la siguiente ponencia para que
Let's get to the
podamos ver.
next presentation so to give him some time to come back.
Creo que
I think it's best.
Se está reconectando.
He's
¿Le damos
reconnecting
tiempo
right now.
o-
Should we give him time or should we move on?
Démosle un momento, por favor.
Let's just give him a second, please.
Okay, I'm back.
Ya,
back?
ya regresé.
Yes. Sorry.
It's okay. We can hear you now, but we can't see you.
Okay. Okay.
Si apaga la cámara, la
I'm really
comunicación se agiliza.
Doctor, would you like to turn your camera off so we have maybe a better connection?
We can hear you, so maybe we could try without the camera.
¿Está conectado? ¿Sigue conectado?
¿Sigue conectado?
Doctor, you're still connected, right?
¿Qué tal si pasamos a la siguiente presentación? y
Let's
le damos
do
para
the
que
next
se vuelva a
presentation
acomodar?
and let's just give him some time to regather. Okay, sounds good. Let's do
Entonces,
that.
vamos a pasar a la siguiente
So
ponencia
let's
y luego
go
volvemos
to the
con el
next
doctor,
presentation
Bertrand.
and then we're
Entonces,
coming back to
tenemos
Dr.
la
Bertrand.
presentación del doctor Paul Lovejoy,
So
que nos
we
trae
have
la ponencia titulada,
Dr. Paul
Resistance to
Lovejoy
Slavery in the Sokoto Caliphate.
with his
Professor
presentation.
Lovejoy, the table is yours.
Go right ahead,
You have 20 minutes,
Professor
and
Lovejoy.
I'll
You
let
have
know
20
if you have
minutes.
5
The
minutes
floor
left.
is all yours, and I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Slavery inevitably involved resistance and struggle. Above all, slavery required flexibility and accommodation in the quest for survival. During a pre-modern period in which healthcare and existing medical treatment alone accounted for high death rates and incapacitation, slavery added an additional strain on survival. And the frequently heavy workloads and harsh discipline, not to mention overseers and masters, whose viciousness went beyond measures to control the enslaved population, added to the mortality rates and efforts of the enslaved to avoid violence and punishment. With little incentive to work and obey other than to survive, resistance could be disguised in benign ways, such as pretended misunderstandings, the slower rhythm of work, and even sabotage. If conditions reached a breaking point, individuals might run away, feign illness, and even strike back, despite the consequences that might ensue. Slavery in the Sokoto Caliphate was no different. The Sokoto case is important for many reasons, one of them being the extent of the slave system, its roots in Islamic law as tempered by local custom and political ideology, and the methodological problems of recovering a largely hidden dimension of the nature of slavery in the context of the jihad movement that had resulted in the consolidation of the Sokoto Caliphate in the 19th century. It should be noted that slavery was not finally abolished in the area I am talking about, which is now largely part of Nigeria and neighboring countries, until 1936, not under British colonial rule that began in 1900, but 36 years later. At this point, I want to very briefly share my screen, if I can, and show you a map of what I'm talking about. Now, what am I going to do? Can you see that? No.
No, we can't. Oh, okay. Now we can see it.
Aha, excellent. Now let me just find my text again. What I want to do here is just demonstrate to you. This is the size of the state that I'm talking about. It was the largest state in Africa in the 19th century, conquered by the British, French, and the Germans between 1897 and 1903. And to give you an example of the area that's particularly important is Kano, the emirate of Kano. There were 33 emirates in the state. Kano was the most important in terms of population, and these other neighboring emirates, but you can see that it's a heavily populated area at the time. And the largest city being Kano. This is a drawing a sketch by Heinrich Barth in 1850, showing scale. And this is one from 1880 that Lady Alpizar brought to my attention, which again gives you a sense of the size of the city, the commercial hub.
Not sharing anymore.
Oops, why aren't I? I'm going to have to forget that because otherwise I'm going to run out of time. But basically what I wanted to do was identify where the Sokoto Caliphate was located, its scale, the importance of Kano as a major center, and just to give you some sense, some flavor. Now, information on the resistance to slavery in the Sokoto Caliphate can be documented in several ways that I want to outline briefly. First, European observers who traveled to the Caliphate in the 19th century observed slave practice, sometimes made detailed comments, which despite bias and generalization offer firsthand accounts that implicitly compared what they thought they saw in the Caliphate with their understanding of slavery in the Americas. Second, contemporary texts in Arabic and in Hausa that refer to slavery explicitly or in the context of other subjects are quite extensive. Third, colonial documentation, especially before 1936, contains a wealth of information and practice under the rubric of colonial rule and aristocratic accommodation, which was known as legal status abolition. Finally, there is a considerable body of oral data based on interviews from the 1970s through the 1990s that document details of enslavement. A reference to correspondence between emirates concerning efforts to recover runaway slaves in the 19th centuries include 120 letters in Chiroma Abubakar's correspondence from Bauchi concern matters specifically relating to escaped slaves. Other evidence from various emirates confirm the close communication in recovering runaways and hence demonstrating the extent of resistance. The official records that have survived document resistance to slavery in the 19th century. To a large extent, analysis had to rely on observations of various diplomatic and commercial expeditions and has not really dealt very much with the surviving accounts or with the oral traditions and recollections of individuals and the collections of houses, stories, fables, proverbs that were collected in the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. There are also several fictional accounts that are based on information apparently drawn from recollections and observations. But most important to me in many ways are interviews that were conducted and in which I was heavily involved in the 1970s and later, which contain relevant information. But these are very difficult to interpret. It's taken me a long time to get my head around all of this because the telescoping that occurs in memories that often confuse developments under British rule after 1903 with conditions during the period of Sokoto independence. As it happens, there is also a wealth of information in various BA dissertations, MA theses, and PhD dissertations that were completed in Nigeria and are not readily accessible. There are various studies that deal with the issue of resistance. Most recently, in my opinion, very excellently, Mohammed Bashir Salah's Plantation Slavery, the Sokoto Caliphate, and especially a most interesting text by Yusufu Yunusa, Tunikan Bayi Dabauta Dabai Adunkule, published in Hausa in 2021. It's a 400-page book that examines slavery in the Sokoto Caliphate within a global history of slavery, which I'm in the process of seeing that it will be republished both in Hausa and in translation by Africa World Press. Evidence of passive resistance is fragmentary, but nonetheless conclusive. Proverbs demonstrate that sabotage and theft were common. Hasada ba tahana ba warado. Envy will not stop the slave from getting his share. That is even if the slave has to steal to get it. Sometimes slaves resorted to protective medicines to fool their masters, although the effectiveness of such measures is open to question. The plant Josia supericocusa was mixed with natron as one preparation. According to Dazel, who compiled botanical information in the 1920s and 1930s, and I quote, "A slave who does wrong rubs his body with a plant or sucks it with red natron to escape detection or to avoid pain if beaten for his fault." In the 1820s, Clapperton reported that an Arab merchant in Cartago slept with a dagger and a loaded pistol because he feared his household slaves. Such stories among the merchant community were common, and it was female slaves who caused the most trouble. Quote, and I quote from Clapperton in 1820s, the master being often strangled at night by the women of his household. As Hogendorn has shown in his study of two Zaria plantations, slaves were even sold for bad behavior. Indiscipline and therefore slave resistance is difficult to quantify, but it appears to have been as common as one would expect, most especially through the practice of selling uncooperative slaves, usually under humiliating circumstances. Recalcitrant slaves were accused of wanting to change masters. Popular tradition even allowed slaves to damage the property of another master as a means of forcing such a sale as a compensation for the damage. Among the Tuareg who did business in the caliphate, cutting the ear of someone's camel was sufficient grounds for such a transfer of ownership. Despite the impression that slaves voluntarily decided to change masters, as the tradition holds, the more likely reason was that masters were tired of insubordination and chose to replace difficult slaves through sale. In Kano, Zaria, and probably other towns, slaves were rubbed with ash and displayed in the marketplace. The ash symbolized their sorry fate, for only recalcitrant slaves were punished in this fashion. Slaves sold as a result of bankruptcy or the division of inheritance were sold privately, and the ash was punishment, not only because it was a visible symbol, but because the slaves slept in rooms filled with ashes until they were sold. The supposedly voluntary nature of these sales conformed with the dominant ideology of the caliphate, which pictured slavery as a benign institution that brought pagans into the Islamic fold. Masters are perceived as the reluctant party, even to the point that they are remembered begging slaves, quote, "Don't take yourself to market." But the reasons that are remembered for such sales are not so different from the conditions of sales in other regimes and other slaves perform. Slaves were demanded to be sold, quote, unquote, because, quote, maltreatment, too much work, lack of enough food, lack of clothes, cursing, and beating. These were the conditions that led to, quote, the worsening of relations between the master and a slave. These are quotes from oral sources that were repeated by many different informants. Through the rich proverbial wisdom of the Hausa language, masters recognized the inherent contradiction in a slave system based on violence and a religious doctrine that emphasized leniency. Slaves were needed as workers. The problem was how to maximize their labor. Another proverb explained the dilemma. Quote, however useless a slave, it is better than a house without one. Komi, Mugun, Bawa, Yayi, Yafiginan, Wolfi. Uselessness is often a sign of resistance to slavery. When possible, slaves worked slowly for their masters, reserving their energies for their own farms and crafts. For discipline, some slaves were sent to prison, as in Kano, and there were beatings, as in Bauchi, and these have been well documented, particularly by Yunusa, whose book I cited earlier, and whom I failed to mention, was actually one of my research assistants, a brilliant man. When I was doing oral interviews in the 1970s, Yunusa went on to become a school teacher and then superintendent of a school district and ultimately Minister of Education in the state of Kano. And he has published a number of books in Hausa, and I specifically suggested to him the importance of writing a book in Hausa about the history of slavery, which he has done. Now, Hugh Clapperton, who was in Sokoto in 1827, learned that disobedient slaves who, on a complaint to the sultans that they would not work, were sent to prison. And Clapperton says, their only food is the bran or husks of millet and sorghum with water, but their friends are allowed to give them food if they have any. It is a filthy place and the terror of the men slaves of Sokoto. The prisoners are taken out 2 and 2 every day to work at the walls or on any laborious work which may occur. In the story of
Professor Lovely, you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you very much. As Clapperton noted in 1927, those who are taken when grown up, men or women, and even boys and girls, run whenever an opportunity offers. And whenever they can, they take their owners' goods or cattle to assist them on their journey. The surviving correspondence between the various emirates concerns efforts to track down such fugitive slaves. These letters accuse people of being fugitive, ask for assistance in locating missing slaves, and announce that the individuals had fled. Correspondence reveals that the governments of Bauchi, for example, was in regular contact with Sokoto, Misau, Gombe, Katagum, and to a lesser extent Muri about these matters. Masters resorted to special charms to prevent flight. They put medicines in the food and drinks of slaves and sometimes smoked the rooms in which new slaves slept. Such measures reputedly confused the slaves so they would not know which direction to follow should they try to escape. A good number of people charmed their slaves immediately. They bought them. I'm quoting now from an oral source, so that they might not try to escape. They did this in a variety of ways. They could put medicine in the food, they could smoke the rooms, and so on. This was, according to Isiaku in 1972, was 91 years old and a slave himself. Even concubines fled, although they were supposed to be treated better than most slaves because of the close relationship with their masters. Again, proverbial wisdom draws attention to the problem. Kunyanga, Yamagana, Cheba, Kikara, Kaitaki, Bakin, Maramaro. Female slaves speak. Say that you will not take manure to the stones bordering the farm. That is, escape. Oral accounts conflict on the frequency of discovery. Some traditions insist that once a slave had escaped, he was gone forever. Imam Imora, who was the imam in Salaga in 1880, but who had come from Kano and lived in Kano for a long, long time and wrote extensively in Hausa about his experiences. Describes that when a slave runs away and is found, he's punished. He is not killed, but he's tied up and humiliated very much. No elder or important person will go to his aid because running away is a grave offense for a slave. And finally, one reason to understand the history of slavery and resistance in the African context, such as the Sokoto Caliphate, is to place the abolition of slavery in historical and global context. Too often, the study of resistance, for example, focuses on different parts of the Americas, virtually without reference to where the first generation of the enslaved came from, that is, Africa. The Sokoto Caliphate stands out because of the scale of slavery in the 19th century. It was on a scale. There were many slaves in the Sokoto Caliphate as there were in the United States at the outbreak of the Civil War. It was on a level comparable to anything in Brazil or Cuba or the Caribbean at any time in history, and Dale Talmadge has specifically labeled the 19th century for the Americas and the Americas only as a period of second slavery. But we now know and challenge this assumption. This is only an American phenomenon. This is a transatlantic phenomenon because the same thing was happening in Africa. That is the concentration of slave populations in specific parts of the continent. So that Talmadge's original conception, demonstrating the great expansion of slavery occurred in parts of Africa at the same time as in the Americas. One could say that in Africa, slavery was turned inward. Certainly the scale of slavery in the jihad states, including Sokoto, was sufficiently large enough to have supplied the whole of the second slavery of the US, Brazil, and Cuba. But that didn't happen. Instead, there was a comparable expansion in the number of the enslaved in Africa to warrant a closer examination of the African side of the Atlantic and a comparison with developments in the Americas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lovejoy. Now we're going to give the floor to Dr. Pape Sheriff Bertrand Basenet. I think you are back.
Yeah, I'm back. Yeah. I will to do it quickly. So
all right.
What I wanted to present is, a community called the Jola that you can find in the Gambia, Senegal, Casamance, and Guinea-Bissau. So that community was said to have been participating to the slave trade. And you can read researchers like Linares who said they deferred their participation to the slave trade. So this is where I borrowed, the term of deferred to slavery. And also you can read Martin Bohm, who wrote about the shrines. Indeed, Linares work on the shrines, how the shrines, by reading the shrines, you can understand how the women has lost her independence, because when the women keep the tradition, they tend to be more independent than the women that let their tradition and be Christianized or take Islam. So you see the difference between a woman who keep her tradition in the Jola and the woman who go to be Christian or a Muslim woman. So those shrines tend to play a role in the Jola community. And among that role, they have a kind of, humanitarian consciousness. You don't kill, you don't loot, you don't steal, etc. So when you read, researchers or Portuguese navigators or sources that tell you, okay, the Jola participated in the slave trade, and when you think that this is a crime and inhuman act, you may ask yourself, so how do they participate, knowing that they have shrines that forbid the selling of a person or the killing of a person? So this is what Martin Bohm trying to understand in his Shrines of the Slave Trade. So now I went to that community also and asked whether we still have those shrines. Indeed, Martin Baum showed clearly that we still have those shrines, but those shrines no longer useful for the same reason they were when slavery was here, when this Atlantic system was here. Now they became shrines for someone who still need economic wealth, which means that those shrines were adopted for a capitalist reason. I mean, I can say they were adopted for the Atlantic mode of production, which is you go to raid, you capture someone, and you sell him to the system. So I question that community. Can you sell someone who belongs to your same community with whom you have the same shrines? And when you look at carefully, there are geographical area where they are forbidden to go and raid and find people whom they can sell. And they will tell you as well, in the past, they don't sell slaves. They have middlemen. So those middlemen are some of themselves. Can I say that? They are siblings. They are the Bainung. Who are the Bainung? Now we tend to represent them in Senegal like a ethnic group. But in our language, Bainung means the other. It means the people. When you don't know someone, you say Bainung, Banyun. It means Banyun. I don't know him. But for the Portuguese, since the 15th century, I mean, starting from the 16th century, when they start, giving description of the people they have met, they say the Bainung are the first of those from the people who live there that they have Christian, and that they use, in the crossing, because when you look at that region, is a region full of rivers or marigo. I don't know how we say it in English. So you cannot go from point A to B without using a boat. So that's why I'm using the notion of pirates, because you cannot delocalize someone from point A to B without using a boat. All that raids they are doing, they know that you will somehow cross a river. So you will do it with a boat. So that kind of brigandage activities, looting, etc., was doing along the coast of the region between the Gambia and Guinea-Bissau, and which was also described as a space very dangerous during that colonization period. So when you study the shrines, I will show the picture because we still have them. And Bohm indeed studied those shrines. He was not allowed to see them, to picture them, I'm sorry. So now I have the ability to picture it and to interrogate what is the role of that shrine. How does our people or our ancestors adopt it? But they will tell you that it was adopted to a specific moment. It's a shrine for revenge. If you come to my house and steal something from me, and at that time it was about raiding a person. So who are those who are raiding? Those are the middlemen. And interestingly, it looks like those are people who fled the region where the Portuguese were or where the Maninka chased them, but they was allowed it. We can see it even during the Portuguese independence. We have a lot of people from the Guinea-Bissau who came in the region of Casamance, but they are still there. They are still there and they still have their siblings, their relatives in Guinea-Bissau. But now they behave like our people from our community. Even if they can return to Guinea-Bissau, you see, they can go to Guinea-Bissau when they have someone who died in their community, they take him back to Guinea-Bissau. We can also transpose that reality from the 1970s to the period of, trying to refuse from, Islamic invasion, whatever. So those people may come to this region and they was accepted. However, they still have the connection with the other world. So the Jola tend to raid those who they know they don't share the same shrines. They don't share the same, interdiction. I don't know how. Yeah, I'm trying to be quick here. So I'm going to show a picture. And this picture, it still exists in our communities. And this is that picture, that shrine that I'm trying to study, and that I will be sharing. My paper will be about it. So I hope you can see me now. So this is how they live there. I hope it's going to work. Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen, but
yeah, I'm trying to find.
We're looking at the Zoom page, not the.
Okay. Okay, sorry. It's coming. I'm still there. You know.
Yeah.
Okay, great. It's coming. I'm trying to show the.
You're proving that not anybody can see the shrine.
yeah. So, Prof. Okay, look at this picture. This is I try to illustrate the way when they raid a slave, how when they raid he's not a slave. When they raid people, when they do raiding, the people they capture, they won't look the direction they are using. They are looking the direction they left. So this is a kind of how they told me how they represent those they raided. So they won't show them the direction they came from. They show they are going. They show them the direction they came from, and this is a strategy so that when they take them to their village, those captured, they won't be able to escape. Which means that once in the village, they will let them free. For a certain period of time. So this is the shrine. The shrine now has changed since slavery has finished. Now it's a shrine used for wealthiness.
Sorry, you are not sharing the screen.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, stop sharing.
Oh, shit. So you see. Oh là là, c'est pas vrai ça. Does it work now?
Yeah, but again, we can see only your Zoom.
And now?
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, so now, this is the boat. When you are captured, you are supposed to look the direction where you belong. So this is the strategy for them. This is the best strategy so that the one who are captured they don't know where to go, where they are going. They know only where they come from. So because once they get to the village, they are afraid. You know, they are not always chained. And this is the shrine. Now the shrine became a wealthy shrine. When you want to find money, you know, not rice, but money, so you still use that shrine. But during the slave trade, the shrines looks like this. You know, this tool is supposed, if you look at carefully, but I will draw it. If you look at carefully, it's a chain. So it is used to chain the person who is captured. So this is the chain. You know, it's made of wood and iron. So I will find. I cannot touch it, otherwise I should pay to do so. So, but I will find someone to draw it when I will submit my paper. So now the person who is captured, when your people, they will let your people know that you are captured, so that you pay 6 cows, you know, to take your relative. Otherwise, if you are not able to do so, if no one came and claim you, they may find, because the man who captured you, if you are 6 or, they will give that kid or the person captured to a member of the family, most of the time a woman, you know, a woman who is living there and who may need hands for her fields. So she will adopt you and you will inherit her, you know. So this is the chain they are using. And so I'm quite interested in by reading Littlefield, Rice and Slaves, you know, ethnicity. And to find out inside, they represent the rice fields. So there are a lot of transformation in those communities. When you go to the field, you don't look the same. You don't plow your field the same way. There will be a team looking at your back. You know, this is the disposition when you are on the field. So when you ask, they will tell you this is a consequence of the past, because you may find raiders. The best way to avoid them is to work together and to have someone looking at your back. So those are elements. So another issue, another element also you have to take into account, in that region, you cannot go there with a horse, okay? That's why the king, this is the woman, the wife of the king. That's why the king, now the king has a broom. The king has a broom, ballet. I don't know how you say it in English. I forget the name. Now he has, but he used to have the tail of how do you say it again? Of a horse. What it represent? When you ask them, it represents that whoever, and it represents Islam and Islamization and the slave trade, etc. When you see a horse in Ziguinchor, when you see a horse, the first thing they have to do is to kill the guy on the horse and to take the tail to the king, because it symbolizes invasion and slave raiders, etc. So those are elements that will be showing, and the role of the fetish and what the fetish looks like. And when the fetish came, it's around the 18th century, if I follow Martin, etc., and Liranès as well. And now the shrine no longer have the same symbol. Now it is used for other things, but we still have the trace of slavery, the period of slavery, etc. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the few technical issues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bertrand. And you are still sharing the screen. There you go. Thank you very much. So, estamos un poquito atrasados. We are running a little bit behind schedule. Entonces, voy a dar tal vez...
We are behind schedule, so I'm going to give maybe 5-10 minutes to collect any questions or comments that people might have regarding the two presentations for Professor Lovejoy or for Professor Akandijak. For the people who are connected, not as channel members, but as assistants to the Zoom, I don't know if we have any comment or question in Facebook or YouTube. So please, if you have any comment or question, please raise your hand or make the comment or question in the chat so that we can open the microphone.
Dice María Elisa Velázquez.
María Elisa Velázquez says, wonderful presentations.
Los panelistas también pueden participar con algún comentario.
Jack says thank you.
Adelante, Esteban.
No estaba seguro.
Esteban, go ahead, please. For Professor Bertrand, I would. We're talking about slavery in the 20th century. Until when is it acceptable and when not? And this concept of slavery. And
Professor Lovejoy, bueno, las formas
to Professor Lovejoy, the daily ways of resistance to slavery, very, very interesting, especially because they are more complicated to document and they happen on a day-to-day basis. But I ask myself, if within the group of people that are enslaved, that are in discussion regarding the abolition, because that is the new wings of research that we have in the studies of African history. For example, with a book from Nafosela, we have coming to float the question again, up to what point do we have the debate about abolition that we have at the personal or group level?
Vamos a recoger entonces varias preguntas y varios comentarios. Tal vez acabo de ver.
Let us gather various comments and various questions. Maria Lisa Velázquez, if I'm not wrong.
Perdón, buenos días.
Hello, good morning.
No sirve mi cámara, pero aquí
My
estoy.
camera is not working, but I
Quería
am here.
felicitarlos por las ponencias.
I'd like to congratulate you on these great presentations, to be able to hear experts speak about this very topic. It's a very important window for our studies. I wanted to ask you, gentlemen, all three of you, maybe a little inspired about on the last which is the traceability we can give from the anthropological point of view in the communities, the African communities that were affected by slavery, mostly those that were affected in the 19th and 18th century. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's just try with one more question and then we will give the floor to the panelists. Any more questions? No? Okay. So allow me to give the floor to the professors so they can answer the question.
Who wants to go first?
Who goes first?
Professor Paul.
Agree.
Oh, no, you go first.
So,
Who's
okay.
Bertrand then?
Okay. So I understand better the first one because my Spanish is not so good. Anyway, for a period, I mean, the first encounters, this area was called, Guinea de Cap Vert, which is from Senegal to Cabo Loure, to Sierra Leone, Guinea de Cap Vert. And the more you go, the Lanzaros, those established, the Portuguese established in the Cap Vert area was more engaged in the region, and they start having, African Portuguese in the area since the 16th century. But for the Jola, these shrines started to be developed. If we follow their saying, it's a very recent one. It was made for revenge only, because they start accepting those who are fleeing the hinterland. So it's around the 18th century that they start creating that kind of, because the reason why I tend to believe that it's in the 18th century is because they will tell you they did it for a short time. They did it for a short time, which is, if they remember it in even during the colonial time when slavery was abolished, they will tell you our ancestors used to tell us we use this one for revenge or to capture people and to sell them to have money. So to participate in the Atlantic system. It's a new phenomenon which is not original. They created it just to face the Atlantic system. So I tend to believe that it's a modern shrine. It's a modern shrine because they just use it to face the Atlantic system, the economic system that are brought to them. So it's fair to say that it's around the 18th century that they start developing that kind of shrines. But we still, again, we still have it, but it's quite different now. You are not going, they forget that raiding people phase, and now use it for luck, to have luck, or to have luck to grow your rice and to sell it, etc. It's no longer for for raiding people. Okay, it's not possible since the abolition of slavery. I don't grasp the second intervention. I'm sorry for that.
Okay. Lovejoy, do you want to follow?
Sure, or I might forget what I'm going to say. Abolition as conceived in the European and American context, doesn't really exist in the Sokoto Caliphate. Now, opposition to slavery in a form of elimination of it did occur. It occurred in several ways. One, for example, there was an enclave in the middle of a number of the emirates on the borders with Borno that was an area known as Ningi. It's a slightly hilly region. And escaped slaves ran away to those places and were incorporated as free people. And so that you see these are pockets of, as it were, of attempts at avoiding slavery, if not actually eliminating it, and it's entirely in the sense of abolishing it. And in particular, there was an element related to Mahdism that occurs very early in the 19th century as an undercurrent in the Caliphate, a belief in the second coming and the end of the world, and therefore the ending of slavery and the ending of the ending of everything. And this elements of this type of movement persist throughout the 19th century, often encouraging people to migrate to the east towards Mecca. Many of them ending up actually never getting as far as Mecca, but ending up in the Nilotic Sudan region, and which is where the Mahdist movement breaks out in 1884, and then spreads back westward across right through the Sokoto Caliphate and even further west. And so there's an undercurrent there that is implicitly anti-slavery, because a lot of the people that joined these movements were slaves who ran away, who escaped, and then were willing to fight their former masters to maintain their independence. In terms of issues related to reparations and recognition and understanding, the issues of reparations in the Americas date to generations ago, in the 19th and 18th century, as we know. But remember, slavery doesn't end here until 1936. We're talking about a much more recent time of adjustments to the period of slavery. That opens up a whole bunch of questions and comparisons and contrasts with what happens in the Americas. And it's a big topic. It's a big topic because, for example, the early colonial records, the first 30 years or so of colonial records, are astonishingly rich in material on slavery. The courts were being used to, in effect, make the enslaved population pay for its own freedom. Freedom was not recognized unless they obtained a certificate of freedom through a court, which involved a payment of money to the master and involved a court fee. We have actually records of, I think, something like close to maybe 130,000 people registered in this way who had to buy their own freedom in the course of the first decades. So things were very different in some ways in terms of how things ended, or the extent to which it's fed into modern problems of Nigeria in it's a whole it's a whole area of research that requires a lot more attention than it's gotten. The focus has tended to be on sort of what is often conceived of as ethnic or tribal differences within countries, rather than seeing the class distinctions that really had developed and were maintained and were reinforced by the way that slavery ended in the Muslim areas in particular that I'm most familiar with. I will have my own comments about Igbo areas too and Yoruba areas, because I think you see a parallel type of pattern in those areas too, where there's just a continuation both of slave trading and people getting caught doing it, and therefore lots of records about what was going on, and all kinds of patterns of that the British in particular, but the French had their own system which was quite parallel. The Germans weren't around long enough to implement fully as much as they would have liked to have done, but they wouldn't have done much differently, which is basically to get people who were enslaved to pay for their own freedom. And they weren't fully recognized in society until that was done. And all of this really speaks to the fact that resistance and slavery, which we're focusing on here, has a counterpart to it, which is that the slave owners and the slave masters and the people that dominate the system ain't stupid. They know how to adjust. They know how to do things differently. They try to maintain their control in various ways. And we have to understand how that type of almost class-based division perpetuates itself.
Muchas gracias, Esteban. Le voy a solicitar un poco de brevedad en la respuesta.
Esteban, sorry that I asked you to be brief, but we have run out of time.
Pregunta la profesora María Elisa.
María Elisa's question on new proposals to link historical studies before the 20th century with anthropology through the oral context. In Angola, there is a civil war that spanned over 4 decades and that finalized officially in 2003, and that impacts profoundly in the historical memory of the country. I did carry out some interviews to the people in the community for my PhD studies. The work was on agriculture, and in the conversations, 2 or 3 phases into the conversation, people would still talk about the Civil War, even without my asking. So you get to realize that the work that you have to do to get beyond the memory of the Civil War to get to previous periods in present time does require specialized attention. It does require work on the memory itself. That was my conclusion, and therefore I haven't used the interviews that I did, the proposals in which I have worked, that I have been working on, instead of talking about the pre-colonial or the colonial history with the division of the Conference of Berlin, which to me is artificial and which was my critique today, with both historiographies based on the work. So what we usually assume is that forced labor was the result after the abolition of slavery. But I am questioning is that forced labor already existed. There was an overarching period. And that should be a continued line and start with different issues. But that's a discussion based on the beginning of the 20th century, and it's bit by bit. The National Museum of Archaeology is in Benguela and in Rwanda. So they emphasize that the material culture of and slave driving society is very reduced. Even archaeologists, the interest for slavery has been not significant in Angola. And my generation already had to confront that lack of detail. We cannot continue dividing historiographically between the pre-colonial and the colonial history with the divide of the Berlin Conference. Thank you very much, Esteban, and thank you very much to our three panelists, luxury panelists in this first session of the symposium. Thank you very much to everybody who has been listening to us on Zoom, on Facebook, and YouTube. Please don't leave. We will now continue. And we will now give way to the second part that we have this morning, which is moderated by Lady Alpizer, Professor. Thank you very much and good morning.
Muchísimas gracias, José Andrés.
Thank you very much, José Andrés.
Aquí. Ajá. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, José Andrés. Can you all hear me?
Bueno, vamos a continuar. Sí. Vamos a continuar con la
Let us
mesa
continue now.
número 2 que tenemos.
Now we're going to have table number 2 for this morning, life histories or life stories in a slave-driving society. And we have 3 panelists that are going to be joining us and who are going to be talking about this issue on specific topics. Allow me to introduce them all as they come to the screen to present. And let us start with Professor Mauricio Melendez, who belongs to the Costa Rican Academia of Genealogical Sciences. The title of his presentation is Barahontas y Marotos, Descendants of African Shipwrecks in Matina, 1710. So he's got a master's in linguistics ever since 1989. He's been a Spanish philologist, mainly has worked with philology's edition in different media, and as of 1984, he's conducted historical genealogical research study. He has published a tremendous amount of books and articles in specialized magazines. He is editor of Suhigi magazine, and he has various papers published as well with different titles and topics, with different projects, for example, in collaboration with Monhall College in the United States. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dr. Melendez, and after that, I will be introducing the other 2 speakers. Thank you, Dr. Melendez.
Lady.
Thank you, lady, for this presentation. Let me just see.
Supuestamente ahora.
Can you hear me now?
Probemos ahora.
Ahora sí,
Can we try? Yes, we can now. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por la presentación.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And as lady says, I will be talking about the Barahontas and Marotos, descendants of a shipwreck in Ceuta in 1710.
No especifican el lugar de el naufragio.
In the documents usually says Matina, but it's actually, as you well know, Spaniards got to America in 1492 and they discovered, quote unquote, in the eyes of the Europeans, a new world. There was not new. It was not discovered by the Vikings, not by the Chinese, not by the Spaniards. It was discovered by the forefathers of the indigenous peoples that probably made it. Those are the true discoverers of what we now understand to be the American continent. Very interesting is the African presence starts from the arrival of Spaniards in this quote unquote discovery process. With Christopher Columbus, we already had some African, and in the conquest process, there were some Africans, there were Spaniards conquistadors, there were indigenous conquistadors, and there were African conquistadors. The conquest process would have not been possible without the mass help of the indigenous peoples that participated in this. We're not talking, it's not 200 or 300 Spaniards were able to actually subjugate the different indigenous peoples. It was with the help of the people that were already here. What does it mean with a third root that is usually forgotten? Well, it means that this is a process of oblivion that started a while back, a long time ago, and that in my case, since 1984, I have been in the search of those roots. And because I found it in my genealogy, and all of the professors lied to me. They said that there were no slavery in Costa Rica, that we all came from Spaniards, from European forefathers, and that slavery was not a reality here in Costa Rica. Those enslaved people whom we come from were absent from our family memories. What has happened in the last 3 decades? It has changed the perception. People do not get scared or is not upset for having African blood, which is what usually happened when I started this process. What did it have to do? The origin of racism. Racism has a very, very big weight in rejecting our African roots, and that it finds its origin in the enslavement, mass enslavement, mostly as of 1542, that eliminated indigenous slavery and that brought a mass amount of slaves to the Americas. So they linked skin color with slavery, and that actually placed people at the bottom of the pyramid of social classes. And that's why it's easy to understand why it would be an abomination or it would be something people didn't like. So we always wanted to, in a metaphorical way, we always just want to be descendants of Europeans, and that's not the case. And we want to eliminate everything that is not linked to that reality. Tatiana Lobo speaks, a promoter of interethnicity studies from the literature in the 90s. That's a while ago. Rest in peace, great friend. And she wrote, and with whom I wrote Black and White all mixed up in 1997. So we have been doing the Afro-Mestizo origins of the Costa Rican population for instance. And she said it's not such as a motherland, it's a fatherland. And she was right, because the Y chromosome, at least for most of the Costa Rican, is usually from Europe, basically Spain. So we do have an ancestral forefather who is a Spaniard, but the mitochondrial legacy leads us into the Americas. We're talking about indigenous ancestral mothers. So that tri-hybrid root that we have in Latin America, in some areas is more prevalent, leads us to the Spanish and African roots. But there too, there is an issue that we tend to synthesize, and that it's really not that, it's not quite that correct, because it's not one single indigenous roots. In the Americas, there were hundreds of indigenous peoples. Some of them would share their language. Many didn't. Many disappeared without leaving a trace in the process when the Spaniards arrived. But there were many indigenous roots. Spain itself, it's not only one root. Of course, you understand that. We're not talking about Catalonia. We're not talking about the Basque Country, the Valesians, or the Galicians. There are very many different types of Spaniards. And in Africa, it's the same. We have different African descents from different peoples. And it's not only one soul or one single African root, because we tend to oversimplify. But the phenomenon is quite more complex than usually thought of. The evidence of this ethnic mixture or mestizaje happens. I do have an ancestral forefather who's a Spaniard. I have an ancestral mother who's indigenous. 9% of African blood, some Italian, a lot of Spaniards, so on and so forth. So basically, in 1995, Ramiro Barrantes and Bernard Morera, geneticists, said that there is an European component of 61% in the Costa Rican folk. So the genotype is the 61, 29% indigenous, and a 9% African. In 2014, in a different research study about the Costa Rican folk genotype, Ramiro Barrantes participated in that one, established that European is rather 46%. It was still high, but lower, 33% indigenous, and 14% African, and about 6% Asian descent. So that means that, yes, indeed, we do have multi-ethnic and multicultural roots, as it is well now stated by our Constitution, and the purity of European roots is rather a myth. Although we must never forget that the Costa Rican folks do have a high percentage of European origins if compared with other places. So it is good to say, and there's this question, it turns out when that you work on genealogy, you're based on historical accounts. And then when you do the geneticist or genetic studies, then that comes to confirm there are some companies that are really up, but they do have a very poor genetic base, and they are not good enough to make any comparison. So what does that mean? It means that in our families, we've got some that have a very high African component, and I like to say this a lot. For example, Cuberos in Costa Rica, it's a last name. There are many of them. None of them come from Spaniards, not from Cubero. The first Cubero, Cristobal Martín Cubero, was the first Spaniard with that last name. Arrived here in 1690. At the end of 1690, he married a Spanish woman, and they had a child, Manuel Francisco Martínez de Cubero, very rich. He became a priest, and he died without sons. But there are 3 suspected daughters. He was a slave-owning family. They owned about 15 slaves. So Cubero come from those slaves, not from their masters. Some of them might have some blood, but they all come from slaves. So what happens in Costa Rica and in Central America, there are families that have Spanish names, but that comes from indigenous people that used their Spaniard names. When you dig into your genealogy, you will find if you do have Spaniard blood based on that. And today we're going to be talking about Barahonas and Marotos. The shipwrecked people in Cahuita in 1710, their recent investigations with carbon-14 of the wreckage wood they found, and bricks, and the chemical composition of all of those materials come from Danish ships that landed in 1510, Christianus V and Federicus IV, that left Denmark, Copenhagen in 1708 to Africa, and then they would be set forth to the Americas with slaves as part of the slave trade. The history is very, Los Lucy's story is very interesting. He's participating in this activity. He described that tract from 1708 until they arrived in 1710 in the Costa Rican Caribbean. That would be very interesting to explore, but we have no time today. By February 1710, Christianus V was carrying 355 slaves. Sorry, 355 were still remaining, but only 318 were still alive. Federicus IV, that originally was carrying 433, back then there were only 358 people alive. So they had lost about 20% of the people who were carried in those vessels. After a lot of incidents, after a storm, they arrive in Punta Carreto. Lucy states that it's probably Cahuita due to the shipwreckage that has been found there. People don't believe so, but the forensics proves make it a little bit more clear to validate that. So the crew committed mutiny, so that the provisions will be enough for the crew. They freed 650 slaves at the beach. Sometime after, the crew took two smaller ships, boats, and leave for Portobello, and the Danish sources allow us to reconstruct all of this trip. Out of these 650 African descent people, the Spaniards captured 6 weeks after 105 and enslaved them and take them to Cartago, a city in the inner part of the country. So they were slaves of the king, and they were sold into slavery in Portobello. Nevertheless, in my investigation, in my research study, when I was actually looking into the processes of De la Haya Fernandez, who was the governor in 1719, only 9 years after their shipwreckage, after a shipwreck, they conduct an investigation because there is a very large percentage of illegal slave trade, because they would get to Matina, which was the main point of arrival in Matina, and there were pirates from the Netherlands, from the UK, to do slave trading without paying taxes and tributes to the King of Spain, and other products as well. So that was Vox Populi back then. That was just from Costa Rica, Guatemala.
hacer una investigación que lleva a cabo Diego de la Haya, y sienta a todos los propietarios,
And
50 en total.
they sit all of the slave owners, Levitario from Cartago, and those that with more. And they determined that 115 slaves, 63 were part of illegal slave trade.
¿Qué es lo interesante para este caso? Bueno,
What's the interesting thing about this case? Well, that there they determined that when the Danish ships hit the shores and the 105 slaves, or a little more, out of the 105 that I was able to document, there were 21 that the governor at that time, who was Lorenzo Antonio de la Granja de Balbín, had kept for himself as payment for what the king owed him. So, in tracking them down, we noticed that effectively Lorenzo Antonio de la Granja de Balbín kept some slaves for himself. He sold the majority of them, and well, he made his money from selling these enslaved people, and many of them did not remain in Cartago. Some of them went to other provinces. They were sold in Nicaragua. I am interested in pointing out Maria Capitana, Francisco Maroto, and Teresa Vara, that we were able to follow their track. We're going to talk basically about Maroto and Teresa Barahona. Miguel Maroto was born in Africa, more or less in 1693, and his name was not Miguel Maroto, of course. One of the most violent elements of the slavery was precisely the elimination of that personal identity. They took your name away. They forbid you from talking your own language. They did not allow you to have your spiritual beliefs, and everybody had to become Catholic, like it was in the territories. So Miguel Maroto is baptized. That is one of the first actions that is carried out by the slaves, the ones that they called at that time, the ones that were arriving recently from Africa. They were baptized with a name. There was not a last name. There was not a surname. And that happened to Miguel, and he was a slave, like I said, of Lorenzo Antonio de la Granja Balbín, and Maroto, just like Francisco Maroto. And Maria, who was known as Maria Capitada. Miguel Maroto starts using, or being known, with the last name of his master. But when his master dies, he is inherited by his mother, who was single, who was called Luisa Calvo. So it turns out that Luisa also had somebody that was called Miguel Maroto. It was a chance because the first slave of Lorenzo Grande was Miguel, and it turns out that Luisa Calvo, who was later his master, had a man who was called Miguel Maroto.
Perdón la interrupción. Nos
Sorry for the
quedan 4
interruption.
minutos.
You have 4 minutes left. Miguel Maroto turns out that he marries Petrona Calvo, and they exchange the last names. Miguel appears as Miguel Maroto, or Miguel Calvo, and then we have Petrona Calvo. And this family that were direct descendants of slaves, although Petrona was a free mestiz, but obviously she had white blood and African blood. Well, as this family grew, their families, their children, dedicated to becoming cocoa producers, and they were very successful producing cocoa. Since he was a slave and his wife was a free woman, their children were free. And that was something lucky for their descendants. And we are not able to find when he was released or liberated. He was still in 1730, he was still a slave. So he had arrived in Cartago in 1720. He was still a slave. His children, his grandchildren, he had descendants. Unfortunately, that is something that we have to follow the track of their descendants, but that we can follow thanks to a social tradition of being a mixed blood with cocoa producers. And sometimes it's very simple to follow their traces, their track, because their names and characteristics are very particular. In the case of the sons of slaves, it's easier because the sons of slaves are always going to be slaves. So there's going to be letter of sale, deeds for the sale, and so forth, and we can easily follow their track. This couple had, let me tell you how many children. They had José Meregildo Andrés, María Jesús Candelaria, Manuel Antonio, and Manuel Narciso. Only Manuel Narciso didn't have children, but the majority did. And the last name that was established for this family was Maroto, although sometimes they appear as Carlos, and later on they appear as Maroto. And nowadays, obviously, they are present in many places in Costa Rica. Their descendants is in Cartago, very close to the Basilica of Los Angeles, and Cervantes of Alvarado, in San Rafael de Oramuno, in Tierra Blanca, in Cot, in Oremuno, and in Esparza, in Punta Arenas, among other places. I will try to abbreviate with Teresa Barahona, who is another one of the slaves or enslaved people. This out of this shipwreck, that in the city of 1771 in Africa, it is very difficult sometimes to determine things like this, because what they used to call caste is very variable. It could be caste tarara, or they might say Congo caste, and that might give you an idea of where they're coming from, but they are very broad. In any case, they were born in 1702, at 9 years of age. She came to Cartago, she was a child, and it turns out that in 1730, we know that she had children, because the mortuary of who was her master, Antonio Barahona. Antonio Barahona had been one of those Spanish who went and captured those slaves, and he takes them to Cartago. But his job was being captain of the Spanish military. So she buys Teresa from Coronel Garibaldi. So it turns out that in 1731, she has 4 children, Jose Antonio, Juan Manuel, Antonio, Jose. Just so that you can have an idea, the value of the asset at that moment of Antonio Barahona, the Creole Spanish, was 7,614 pesos, of which his 14 slaves represented 12% of his fortune. It is very important to know, because in Cartago, the most powerful families, well, not all of them, but a good part of them, had about a 30% of their value in slaves. Slaves that worked their farms, the cocoa farms, or their cattle farms. They attended to the domestic services, and many times they also had a job for which they were also making money in the job of these people that were enslaved. Teresa then was the grandmother of Diego Barahona, that later on, when he changes his name to Francisco Carazo, he starts using Carazo. But Carazo was a son to Sofía Barahona. Diego was a mixed blood. He had a little bit of Spanish. We don't know who, but we can always suspect. In the case of the genealogy of los Molat, the component of blood of his masters, of people related to their masters. Diego gets married 3 times, the 3rd time with Ramona Moreira, and he has not less than 10 children. His descendants are now in Cartago and Heredia, mainly. And as a curious note, in the journal, in newspaper articles of 1710 and 11, they interviewed Josefa Carazo Morera, who was a daughter of that previous slave, and he died in 107 years of age, and she was an exception, and she is interviewed. There are photographs. Unfortunately, I have a problem with my computer, and I have to connect through my cell phone, but it is very interesting, because it collects the story of this a daughter of slaves that has a outstanding memory, and she makes a memoir of everything that she had lived in almost 100 years. And almost all she said was corroborated. And I recommend, because there's an article that was written by a friend of mine that it's called The Fantastic Century of José Paclado. Without furthermore, we give the floor to the next presenter, and we thank you all for your attention and for attending this symposium. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Mauricio.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. We are going to give way now to the next presentation that is called History of Life in Esparza, the North Pacific of Costa Rica. This is in charge of the Dr. Maria Josefa Acuña, who is the Director of History of the University of Costa Rica, and she is a researcher of the Center of Investigation of Identity and Culture of the Latin America of the University of Costa Rica also. She is an educator in the Western facilities in San Ramon, and she has to do with facilities of Afro-descendants and colonial history and multicultural perspectives in the formation of identity studies. We're going to give her the floor so that she can talk to us about this presentation that she has for today. And thank you very much for being here and welcome. No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be able to listen to the colleagues and with those very, very, very interesting presentations. We are going to share here a little bit to see if you can observe it. Please let me know if you can see it.
Sí, lo podemos ver.
Yes, we can see it.
Excelente. Bien.
Excellent.
Entonces, iniciamos, ¿verdad?
So we begin
con esta presentación
with this presentation that has the title, Histories of Life in Esparza and the Northern Pacific. What I am proposing is an exploration of the daily livelihood of the inhabitants, both descendants of this region, that is Esparza, the valleys of Cañas and Bagaces in the North Pacific of Costa Rica, that would allow us to get a glimpse of some of the livelihood stories of these individuals. The region of the Northern Pacific, as you can see it in this map, comprises the peninsula of Nicoya and the western coastal region of the Gulf of Nicoya. In this one, you can distinguish the different subregions. Precisely, the Gulf of Nicoya, the Valley of Tempisque, and the valleys of Bagaces, Cañas, and Esparza, which come to end up being the inland spaces. This last separation is the one that extends to the southeast of the Cañas River, and here you can observe in the map. You can observe in the map.
Si gusta, le da como
If
compartir en
you
grande.
wish, you can share it in large as the presentation so that we can appreciate the presentation a little bit better. Let's see how I do that.
Puede ser a la izquierda.
Down at the bottom, right there. Yes, presentation. Sorry, yes.
Vamos a ver.
Ahora sí.
Ahora
Okay,
sí.
is that better?
Excelente.
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you.
Perdón.
Sorry about that.
Bien, entonces, como pueden,
So,
como
as
les
you can
decía, ¿verdad?
see, as I was saying, in this subregion, this is the southeast of the Cañas River, parallel to the waters of the Gulf of Nicoya, and to the Jesus Maria River, which corresponded to the jurisdiction of the province of Costa Rica
de acuerdo a este otro mapa,
according to this other map that extended from the Salto River to the Boruca River. It is in this. I'm going to present to you another map where we can appreciate better the valleys of Esparza and Caña and the location that they have in the Costa Rican territory. In this subregion is where they founded in 1854 Villa Vicelas, the Real of La Ceniza, and the Port of Nice. And it also has the settlement of Aranjuez and the port of Rivera in the river of the same name. These populations, as mentioned, are identified as the real background of Costa Rican population. And that would be then the province of Costa Rica. It is important to mention that Esparza was founded in 1574 and in the port of La Caldera in 1570 was a colonial city at the point of the transfer, and it was maintained as the administrative center for the Dry Pacific among the rivers of Great Atlánticas. In the 15th century, the region of Esparza it was characterized for the domain of the great property related to the farms. In its beginning with cattle, and then it was eventually going to become the cattle. And then the Valley of the Annex for centralized activity destined to the transportation of merchandise. Therefore, the cattle farms became the main economic and social activity as a response to the dynamic originated by the north of Central America and the cocoa production in other places. Consequently, there was a migration of individuals to the inside of the countries as labor for the houses and the parcels for the family. The owners of properties in these jurisdictions but they are located. We have some mestiz, some
Bien, en los valles de Esparza y el Tempisque, los historiadores han
in the valleys of
comprobado
Esparza and Tempisque, the historians have demonstrated that the second configuration period that was developed between the years 1879 and 1821, the maturity in the construction and development of the territory established populations like Bagaces, Cañas in 1739, Avangares in 1715, and more lately, the village of Guanacaste in 1729, which we later came to know with the name of the city of Liberia. A very important the population was populated inhabitants for religious and social centers in those territories. those places were the place where the Spanish and mestizos, and especially
desarrollaron su cotidianidad, la cual estuvo matizada
which was
muchísimo, ¿verdad? Por la
the mulattoes, which were characterized by the dynamic of the cattle production farms. In ethnical terms, the historians that have investigated these subregions as a place that is made up mainly by the owners of those farms and their foremen, while the descendants breeds are determined as the majority population in those settlements.
En cuanto
for
a
those farms,
voy a presentar aquí un cuadrito así de manera
and
muy
here I'm going to present
rapidita.
to you a chart very quickly,
En donde se presentan
where
los bautizados en
we
la ciudad
show
de Esparza
those
para
baptized
los
in the
siglos
city of Esparza
XVIII y XIX en el
for the
periodo
18th and 20th century.
1621. Aquí se registran un total de
And here we can see
2.141 bautizados.
1,000
1.686 fueron identificados en las etnias de mulatos,
2,176 baptized.
de acuerdo con este cuadro,
1,608 of them were identified as mulatto,
la cual
while
representó el
205 were mestizo.
58% de los bautizados
And
en la
this
ciudad de
represented that
En cuanto a la legitimidad, los mulatos libres
legitimacy,
tenían
the free
86%,
mulatto
los negros libres
had
un
an
83%, y los negros y mulatos nacidos en
and the
condición
black
de
and the
esclavitud con
mulattoes and the
23,5%.
with
En
23.5%.
cuanto a la ilegitimidad, los
In regard to the
hombres
illegitimacy,
esclavos presentaron la mayor. Con un
the majority was represented by
73,6%,
mulatto with
los negros libres con un 16,7%. Y los mulatos libres
the slaves
con
with 76.5%,
los ambos
and the
con
free mulattoes with 15.3%,
12,5%.
and the sambos with
En el censo
12.5%.
borbónico de 1782, para la
And the
ciudad de
census
Esparza y sus
of
valles de Barrazas,
1821 for the cities of Esparza and Bagaces, they had a total population of
109 fueron españoles y 729 se clasificaron como mestizos, mulatos y negros. En Cañas,
mulattoes and mestizos. In Cañas, in 1800 and 1821, they recorded a total of 621 that were baptized, which 251 were mulatto and 75 were qualified as mestizo indigenous and Spanish. Also, this is in the region of Esparza, Bagaces, and Cañas. Well, this is covered by a series of activities and events that demonstrate the daily doing of the inhabitants of that territory. And this is produced in the knowledge of their livelihood stories. So they worked permanently or seasonally in the work structure, labor structure of what is the farm. They became cowmen. They also worked in agricultural tasks, and so tasks that were carried out during the summer, and it consisted on looking at the sites to check the cattle for the milking, the manufacturing of the cheese, as well as the killing, the slaughter, and the breaking down of the cattle, and the production of leather and so forth and soap. Likewise, they built and they gave maintenance to the farms in which they were working, to the facilities. An example is that of Mr. Miguel Antonio Nanue, who is natural from a firm land, mulatto, that is located within the Sur Valley, where he had a very extensive. He was also a merchant. He had his own ship and his own boarding dock, and he negotiated with Acapulco. And there was even a shipyard in this farm. Another story is that of Pablo. He is an indigenous that is natural from the population of Barba. He worked as a foreman in the farm of Nuestra Señora Carmen, which was located in the convent of San Francisco, in the city of Holy Spirit of Esparza. Another one is a free mulata with which he had a daughter, what's called Juana Maria, who was 3 years of age. And with this, we confirm the individuals of these groups. They carried out their migration, internal migration, in the company of their families. This story begins a day in the morning when his father was leaving the farm on horseback, taking his daughter. The girl goes back to the house, and she comes home where she has, where the mother is there, and the horse is saddled there. The father was found by a group of people that were passing by Esparza on the way to Nicaragua, within the field, somewhat away from the walking field, walking track, and he was dead. According to the authorities at that time, she, the wife, did not make any accusation about the disappearing of the husband to any of the authorities of her jurisdiction. That is why the governor ordered that she had to be transferred along with her daughter to Cartago, by 2 security guards taken to the city of Cartago. And once in Cartago, they put up a couple of bracelets, and they were thrown into the slammer. They were taken to Guasimayo, so that she could be kept under observation, but no declaration was made. And then the governor asked the child who had killed her father, but she could not talk about this. She was still not very good in expressing herself. And so there was no response for the governor. Neither is it indicated what happened to the daughter while the mother remained in jail.
Los testigos declararon haber encontrado al indio tendido en el suelo con su mano debajo de la cara sin herida ni señal de que le hubiesen quitado la vida, porque no encontraron sangre en el suelo. De ahí que se
Witnesses say that they found the father there, dead, with a hand over his face, without any blood on the face. So Josefa was left free because it seemed to be that it was an accident. In this case, the justice thought about applying all the weight of the law, and they treated the mulata as somebody dangerous. She was put in jail, and she was handcuffed and everything, and she was never given the opportunity to defend herself, as she was discriminated given her condition of woman and mulatto, and as one of the fundaments in the good administration of the law. Another case in the site of San Jerónimo, in the corral, the workers looked at the cattle of the captains Francisco and Jose Morena. We cannot forget that there were mulattoes in this region.
Hubo acontecimientos como lo sucedido entre el mulato llamado Cornelio, natural de Nandaibe, residente en el Valle de Bagaces, que llegó muy enojado a discutir con José Miguel Martínez, indígena y trabajador en el hato de esta hacienda San Jerónimo.
4 minutos.
Muy bien. El alcalde llegó al sitio de San Jerónimo y describe lo siguiente: encontré al mencionado herido ya difunto, y registrado el cuerpo le vi una herida como de 3 dedos en el estómago. y solicitando por el agresor, me dijeron todos que había huido en el mismo instante en que sucedió el hecho. Se considera que el agresor huyó de la jurisdicción y por esa razón se dio parte del delito al teniente de Nicoya para que arrestara a Martínez en una demostración de que la administración de la justicia se basaba en un entramado de jerarquías que incluía la justicia y las jurisdicciones, donde todos los obedientes súbditos se preocupaban por el cumplimiento y consecución de la justicia. Voy a ser muy brevecita aquí para poder hablarles de otra historia, ¿verdad? Para no quedarme así como muy cortita. Las tareas realizadas por los mozos fueron, por ejemplo, ir a la sabana a echar una res para matar, faena asignada a los mulatos libres, por ejemplo, o amolar una lanza, o como en el caso del sambo Francisco Duarte, natural de la ciudad de Granada, que andaba sabaneando a caballo. Sin embargo, su vivencia fue más allá de esta labor. Tenía el oficio de sastre. Viajó con ganados y bestias desde la villa de Nicaragua, traficó trastos y bestias en el Valle de Bagaces, pero luego se reportaron que esos bienes eran robados. Asimismo, fue detenido por el delito de rapto contra una niña de 10 años llamada María Dolores Porras. Ella declaró que la sacó violentamente de su casa, del lado de su madrastra, y de otra mujer llamada María Lorenza, y le ató las manos a un árbol, y habiéndola dejado de aquel modo, volvió a la casa, en cuyo intermedio tuvo tiempo de asustarse y huir. En la práctica se tenía una baja estima, un proceso donde las agraviadas eran mujeres. El juez insistió nuevamente en que, sin embargo, de ser las declarantes mujeres, debo demandar y mando que se haga por mí todas las diligencias más activas que sean conducentes. Eso queda demostrado en el hecho que las autoridades buscaron acusar el sambo de robo y abigeato en una forma de validar el criminal proceder de Duarte para poder remitir la causa a una instancia mayor, a la ciudad de Cartago y al juzgado del gobernador. Nada más les menciono los otros dos casitos, ¿verdad?, que yo tenía para presentarles. Y es el de que los trabajadores de las haciendas,
the workers in the haciendas were actually conducted to other tasks. For example, that all the mulatto would be conducted without excuse in the corn plantation of the community, and that caused for a mutiny in Bagaces led by Agosto Centenes, mulatto captain of the brown population of Bagaces. And
se da el caso de
it's
una
also a case of a strife between Santiago Cibajo, free mulatto of San Jose de Heredia, who was a worker in Alto de Buenavista, with the Miguel Contreras, who was indigenous in Barba. The mulatto fought with the indigenous man, and the mayoral hit him and laid him on the floor. And after that, during the nighttime and the wee hours of the morning, without any previous notification, with another partner, took him to the church of Sparsa and buried him there without telling anybody. And the last case is Dolores Campo, a brown maid who worked in Felipe Argurola, with whom she had 3 children. She was tried and sent with her baby, who was still being breastfed, to Sparsa and then sent to Bagaces.
Al señor lo justificaron porque estaba muy viejito, ¿verdad?
The
Con sus
old
achaques,
man
pero al
and the
final,
widower was forgiven because he was
el amo muere,
very elderly,
le hereda
but
todos los bienes
when
a los
he
hijos
died,
y los
he
dejó
inherited
como propiedad.
all of his lot
Gracias.
to his children with her. Sorry about my
Buenos
being
días.
so quickly.
Gracias.
Speak so quickly.
Muchas
Thank you so
gracias,
very
María,
much. Thank you,
por
Maria,
esta presentación y
for this
vamos
presentation.
a dar
And we
paso
are
a la
now going to
última
give the floor
presentación de esta
to
vez
the last
para
presentation
después
of
tener
this
un
table
espacio de
so that
preguntas.
we can have a
Entonces, les
Q&A
invito
session at the
también
end.
a
So
que
I
si tienen
invite you all,
comentarios,
if you
preguntas,
have
los
any
pueden dejar
questions,
en
any
las diferentes
comments, that
redes,
you can
tanto
actually
del Facebook, de la
write them
cátedra, de
down,
la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales,
Facebook
de
and
YouTube,
the
y a quienes nos
social
acompañan
sciences
en el Zoom también
account
pueden dejar
and
sus
YouTube,
comentarios o preguntas
and you can leave your
en
comments
el
and
espacio
questions
para esto.
in the
Y
chat box as
además,
well.
otro anuncio, perdón,
On top, and that's
tenemos
just another announcement.
un
We do
formulario
have
que está circulando
a
en Facebook en el cual también pueden
a
dejar su
form
opinión
that we
respecto a la
are
actividad y
publishing
lo
in
pueden ir
Facebook,
tomando
and this
también
is to collect your
en ese
opinion on
proceso.
this activity. So
Vamos a
please,
pasar
we're asking you to do
entonces
that.
con la doctora
Now
Ulrike
we
Schmeider,
have
quien nos acompaña
Ulrike
desde
Schmeider,
Alemania, desde la Universidad de
doctor from
Leibniz en
Germany,
Hannover,
from the University
y
of
ella estudió
Leibniz in Hanover,
realizó estudios
and
latinoamericanos
she
en la
has
Universidad de
Latin
Rostock y
American
recibió su
studies in
doctorado en la
Rostock
Universidad de
University
Leipzig.
and got
Ha
her PhD
participado
from the Leipzig
como
University.
asistente de
She has
investigación desde el
participated
Departamento
as
de
an
Ibérico y
assistant in
Latinoamericano
investigations in the
del
Iberica
Departamento de Historia de
Department
la
and
Universidad de
Latin American
Colonia,
Studies in
también
the Köln
en la
University
Universidad de Hannover.
and
Tiene
in
vasta
the
experiencia
University of
como
Hanover.
docente,
She
coordinadora e
is a
investigadora.
professor and an
Ella es
investigator, a
por ejemplo,
research
de estudios
investigator
atlánticos y globales
in
de la
the
Universidad de
Center
Hannover.
of Atlantic
Trabaja en un
Studies of the
proyecto
University of
titulado
Hanover,
Memorias de la
and
Esclavitud
she works
Atlántica,
on a project
Francia, la
called
Hispana,
Memories of the
el
Atlantic
Caribe, Fronteras
Slavery
y Cuba en
Friends, the French
comparación,
Caribbean,
y en el
and
contexto
Cuba
de
in
los debates
comparison, and
globales
in the
sobre la
context of
memoria
global
de
discussion
la
on the
trata
memoir
de personas
of
esclavizadas y la esclavitud.
slave
Su
trade and
investigación
slavery.
también se centra
Her
en la
investigation
historia
is also
comparativa de
focused
género
on the
de América
comparable
Latina,
story
la
of the
esclavitud y la
gender
historia
study
posindependencia
and the
de
post-independent story
América Latina y el
history
Caribe,
of Latin
basado
America and
también
the
en la
Caribbean
memoria.
as the
Tiene
memoir.
vastas
So
publicaciones en
she has
diferentes
a
libros,
tremendous amount
pero
of
los voy a dejar con
articles
ella
published and
para
books.
que nos hable
Without
sobre
further ado,
historias
let
de
me
vida de
give her
mujeres
the
y de
floor.
hombres africanos
That speaks
esclavizados,
about
su presencia o
enslaved
ausencia
men
en
and
museos
women,
y
their
exposiciones, que es el
presence
título de la
in our
ponencia que nos
exposition,
tiene
which
para hoy.
is the presentation
Bienvenida,
for today.
Ulrike. Un placer verte
Welcome,
por acá.
Ulrike. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias por la amable presentación y invitación aquí ya de
Thank you for
noche
the
de Alemania.
presentation, introduction, and thank you for
Vamos
the
a
invitation. I'm
presentar,
coming to you from Germany.
compartir la
Let me
pantalla.
see if I can maybe
¿Ustedes
share
lo
my
ven?
screen. Can you see my screen?
Claro, claro que sí.
Sí.
Perfectamente.
Y ahora es la pregunta si también lo ven cuando lo muevo. Sí.
Can you
Sí,
see when
también.
okay,
Bien.
when I move my slides, you can see it. Okay, thank you very much.
Sí, comienzo directamente.
Let me start then.
El título ya fue anunciado. Bueno,
This
si
was
un
already
museo o
introduced.
una exposición quiere
There
representar la
was an
historia de la
exposition
esclavitud de
must
una manera
represent the history
descolonizadora y
of slavery
ancestral,
in a
podemos
way that
repetir
it's
la
no
visión del
longer
Estado colonial y de los
inconvenient with
esclavizadores que conciben a
the
las
colony,
personas esclavizadas
and
únicamente
so
como
that the
fuerza de
enslaved
trabajo
person
y mercancía.
become as an
En
element of
lugar
the
de esto,
workforce.
debe individualizar a
Instead
las
of this,
personas
must
cautivas y darles
individualize
un
all of the
nombre para
captive
contar su
people
historia de
so
vida,
to tell
explicar su
their story
resistencia
and
y
their life
resistencia
story
contra
and
el
to
sistema
explain their
esclavista y
resistance
sus
against the
protagonistas.
slavery system and its
Estas fuentes que
protagonists.
reflejan la
And we
perspectiva de
need
las
to
personas
actually use
esclavizadas
references in the
y
sources
sus
so that we'll have
descendientes.
the perspective
Esa
of the
opinión
enslaved
comparto
people.
con expertos y expertas
So
en historia,
this is the
antropología y
opinion I
filología
share with
que
experts in
analizan la
anthropology
presentación de las
that
esclavizaciones en
analyze
museos y sitios
the
históricos
this
y los critican y
perspective
hacen
from different
propuestas
museums.
alternativas. Por ejemplo, Stephen
For
Small, der
example,
vereidigt
Stephen Small,
für seine
Representation of
Themen.
Slavery, Race and Ideology Implementation
Otras colegas,
Museums.
Cincy Vaillon y
Other
José
colleagues,
César
for
Steinman,
example,
han expresado
Kristen
profundas
Gallas
dudas
and James
si el
DeWolf Berry
museo
have
en su origen
experienced
una institución
very,
colonial
very she doubts if the museum can actually represent the enslaved people without repeating the colonialist and slave-driven ideology. While I do understand these doubts, it is very problematic because it excludes the enslaved people from the national history. And since the museums are very many times are showing children, I'd like more to discuss a little bit more how this can be shown, and there will never be perfect representation. That decolonization, it's a way, not a goal. So, and so that we can multiply the content, it's important to include these communities in the conception of their museological discourse. I'm going to show now some positive examples in which the stories of men and women are shown in the museum with the purpose of having a decolonizing relate. And this is in the museums, the different types of museums that repeat the colonial perspective and the racist stereotypes. The British Museum in London, in Berlin, the National Museum of Anthropology in Madrid, they show objects of the colonial times and actually do not give any insight in indigenous artifacts without modification whatsoever. So, this is the museum in London, in the UK, the National Museum of Copenhagen, Denmark, the National Museum in African American History in Cash and Worcester, United States, the structure in the Curacao, the Savannahs of the Plat, in Martinica, Valette, and in Mexico, without showing the enslaved people. They present their witnesses, and you can see the resistance against slavery and racism from the era of the post-emancipation till today. So here you can see these are expositions like this one in France, in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, in Frankfurt, Germany, or the Memoir of San Jose, Costa Rica. In this exhibition, it controls everything that we know about some enslaved women in Guanacaste. So we were able to learn, for example, the Maria Faustina de los Ángeles, enslaved daughter of Manuela Pacheca, an unknown father, had to be sent to the Polilla Musares and Senor Viales, and she was emancipated with 49 years of age. Her last, Gonzalo Morales, died in 1838, sorry. In this way, slavery does not appear as an economic system anymore, but a way to beneficiaries and exploited. The reality of the National Museum of Costa Rica speaks of slavery and the diverse cultural roots in the African people that were found and transported to Costa Rica. In the Afro-mestization of Cartago and the discrimination of the African castes. And this is, nevertheless, we have not been very specific about the victims nor the perpetrators of slavery. The memory we have, it talks about the enslavers and the resistance of the enslaved persons. In, for example, it's also mentioned in the Protestant churches, in the Mason lodges, it is also acknowledged in the Afro-descendant as conceived as foreigners, the same people had been born in the country and they could opt for the Costa Rican nationality, citizenship. Conducting some interviews with very important personalities of the Afro-descendant Costa Ricans, I would have liked to know how to evaluate or to assess this new morphology of 2017. But out of the 12 persons that were interviewed, only Scarlett, who is a writer, were able to acknowledge the museology, but also that Costa Rica needed something similar, like museum in Panama. It seems like the National Museum has lost the trust of the Afro-descendant community due to conflicts in the diaspora and in the Afro-Caribbean population before 1970, and because the African Costa Rican community, I wanted to present to the public, for example, in Puerto Limon. These are the people who are enslaved and before they were enslaved as authors, and whether as anti-slavery warriors and politicians, abolitionist politicians, the museums, and the mechanism dedicated to slavery sometimes talk about resistance and they got both groups. For example, Cimarrones in Jamaica, the revolution of the enslaved in Haiti, this the strategy network in Jamaica in 1931, the anti-slavery thinkers like Alcazar, like Cancio Sanchez, or Javier Cartman. The museums of the port cities of human trafficking, like Musée d'Histoire Nantes, mention the Haitian history, but they do repeat this history of white abolitionists that freed enslaved women in ultramarine departments in 1848. It does not mention the insurrection of the enslaved persons in Martinique that speaks at the abolition in Martinique and these parts of the world. The Martinique museums provide honor to white abolitionists, but it does not speak actually get the participation of the emancipation. This contradicts the memorial culture in the public space in which there are monuments for Cimarrones and the insurrected in 1848. Only private museum by the descendant of a descendant woman gives honor to white and black abolitionists, the insurrected of 48, so the participants of this background, historical background. The academic and anti-racist activists are very angered by this silence. And other demand the creation of a public museum on slavery and their connection with the Caribbean. This should go beyond just presenting a map. But all of the cultural achievements of the African societies. In the Netherlands and British and Danish Isles, they have monuments to enslaved rebels, and they have museums like the Pompeii Museum in Nassau, Bahamas, the Chile Museum, Canapa, and Curacao, and we are all based on new technology and new techniques. So we need the separation. They also demands the financing of museums and cultural centers. In Cuba, it is mentioned, all of the enslaved, for example, in Africa, in Habana, in Matanzas, and the slave museum. Nevertheless, despite the independence story, always starts with Carlos Meneses Céspedes, always starts who liberated their enslaved persons in 1868, and not with Antonio Aponte, which was in 1812. It means 57 years before the whites themselves. And to the academic and the racial activists like Roberto Surbano, Heriberto Ferrauti, and Daisy Rivera Castilla, Gisela Aranda, Tomás. There are some racist and slave drivers that are minimized by the mid-class government, the role they would play, and that were anti-colonialist. It's never really told in the full dimension. And then we have like and the racist massacre of 1912 revealed by the African researcher.
Un paso en dirección en el sentido de conmemorar más el rol de líderes afrocubanos en la lucha por la independencia y un Estado igualitario.
And an equalitarian state, and this is part of the cultural center that had very many of the results in La Habana. It celebrates the Afro-Cuban general who fought in these 3 wars, who was assassinated in 1906 by the white president against a racist policy that had actually opposed with other Afro-Cuban persons. And then just a critique on all the different museums with abolitionist approaches. We need to remember there are European countries when this slave driver past is hidden almost completely. For example, Portugal, who was one of the greatest powers in slave trade through the Atlantic. For example, you can talk about Enrico Navegador and the discoverers. And these are assassins of indigenous cultures. And this is the example of the Museo de Marin and the Bandera de Jerónimo. And this is in the capital of Lisbon, of African people and the African colonies of Portugal. The morphological nucleus here reminds us of the African descents that were taken into the slave trade. And this is part of the colonialist past. In Spain, the situation is no better. Most of the museums do not tell nothing about the slavering of indigenous peoples. They deny the existence of the colony of Equatorial Guinea until its independence until 1968. The Museo de América, with the title The African Immigration, that describes Black slaves as labor. They do not talk about the racism of the chest paintings with the Cimarrones and Afro-Indigenous people and the mulattoes. In the democracy, it is not explained that chest are entities that are it's a construct, not natural ethnic groups. The festival brings some awareness on the heritage of the many Afro-descendants and for a cultural or the memory that will be decolonizing and that will allow to provide a more truthful recount of the things that happened. We are yet to see if the Ministry of Culture does express themselves about a division of the decolonizing of the state museums, maybe some deep
Ulrike,
reforms.
perdón, 5 minutos.
Sí,
Ulrike, you have 5 more minutes.
bueno, el Museo de Historia de
So,
Cataluña
the Museo of History in Catalonia, the Museum of History in Catalonia, and the Maritime Museum in Barcelona show the captives with snakes, sorry, with chains in certain boxes. So in the Maritime Museum, when it's not individualized, slave drivers or enslaved people, and no names are mentioned, no life story, no act of assistance by the Africans that are presented as victims and merchandise.
Esto es particularmente grave.
This is particularly grave because in certain Hispano-American countries and Cuba, the African Americans got their freedom from the wars for independence.
In México, la temprana abolición de la esclavitud.
So the early abolition of slavery was decreed in 1829 by the president, the representative afrodescendant, Vicente Guerrero, who was independent.
Todo esto negado en los museos españoles.
And this is all part of the Spanish museums. On the contrary, in France, Britain, and the Netherlands, there are no monuments for the enslaved persons or Afro-descendant personalities. All the museums are silence the resistance of the enslaved persons and the abolitionists. This is a temporary. It was shown in 2021 in the Museum of American Mention, the Haitian Revolution and the sublimation of the leads, which was the first case of touching the topic and this color. But in Hispanic America, it does not show or reflect the reality of Mexico or the African warriors from Mina Cabota that were rebelled in 1844 in Cuba. Not the Juan Francisco Manzana, who was enslaved poet, and nor the thousands of complaints by enslaved people before the colonial authorities that actually give us an insight to their generations and their lives. This is a set of documents that was published in 1996. Shows the lack of evidence of people, lack of witness of enslaved witnesses, enslaved people's witnesses that are not accessible. That's, for example, the ISIS Museum in Bremen, in Hamburg, and the exploitation of enslaved persons. Much of the German population understand and know, and like, for example, the Bremen or the International Maritime Museum in Hamburg present slavery with no more than just one exposure or one, but it does not mention, for example, the role of the local. They don't talk about the resistance of the enslaved people or the individualized. Two rooms in the Maritime Museum in Hamburg show the participation of local traders in the slave trade, but they do describe as anonymous victims, not as human beings that actually act in the defense of the right. Only temporary in Hamburg and Hanover, the resistance of their persons enslaved and their dependents were also mentioned there. Nevertheless, they didn't talk about the life trajectory of enslaved men and women. They didn't talk about sources either in which the African captives were able to talk about their witness. So various European states have silenced the voices of enslaved men and women, and they did not reveal the origins of racism. Let's hope this symposium will help us overcome the silence. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, profesora, por esta excelente
Thank you very much,
presentación.
Professor, for your great presentation.
A todos los panelistas,
And to all of the panelists,
sobre
thank you very much about the life stories that has led us to different parts, different regions, different spaces through time with different methodologies as well. So now we would like to give the floor for the next 10 minutes so that we can gather some questions and comments on the Zoom session, as well as if you want to do it in our social networks. Rina? Professor Rina, is your hand raised? Thank you.
Bueno, profesora Schmieder, fantástica.
Professor Schmieder, great investigation. I was there at the beginning of your investigation, and I can see the results, and I can see it's absolutely impressive, the depth of your studies, covering so many areas. And it is a call to action for all of us in here of how do you come from the investigation to the public realm and how the public realm reproduces certain images. My question would be, after having conducted all of these study, not only countries, but languages and stories and locations, what do you think would be the cause? What is the common line or the common thread? Why is this lack of acknowledgement, historically wise, for Afro-descendants in Americas and Europe?
¿Debo responder directamente o cuál?
Should I answer now? Should I address your questions, or are we going to have more questions? In the moment, we don't have. Okay, we have one more. Maria Elisa Velázquez. Let's do 3 questions maybe, and then we will give the professor time to. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Vamos a ver.
Gracias.
Bueno, quería felicitar a los ponentes. También
First of all, I just wanted to congratulate the speakers for Maria de Los Angeles, which I believe was very, very interesting. That actually divides the groups using the category of ethnic groups. That is a little bit more modern, that has to do a little bit more with anthropology. And as far as I understand, the term to make difference between the groups in the colonial would be qualities. And that has a different vision, of course. And it's important when we talk about, when we do interpretation of how the groups were divided, we need to understand that in the colony, it was not same to talk about quality than ethnic group today. That brings, or caste in some situations.
Para la ponente Schneider.
And for Schmieder, I think it was very, very interesting, this cosmovision of how this history of African slavery has been exposed in Europe. And she said that the caste patterns were racist. Why? Why do you have that perception? Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesora Velázquez.
Thank you, Professor Velázquez. Do we have any more questions over here? Let's see, Zoom. At the moment, we don't have on our social networks. So those of you that are here with us on social networks, so please, if you have any questions, you can leave them here in the comments. And now let's
nuestros
give the
panelistas
floor
para
to the
hacer la
panelists
respuesta de
so
los
they
puntos
can
que se
address
acaban de
the
hacer.
questions.
Y puede iniciar
And
cualquiera de las dos.
please take the floor as you
Bueno,
see
tal
fit.
vez lo mío sería, ¿verdad? Con el
Well,
permiso
in
de la
my with
profesora Ulrich, este,
if Enrique lets me go first.
agradecerle
Well, first off, thank you
María
very
Elisa
much,
Velázquez,
Maria
¿verdad?
Elisa
Por
Velasquez,
la observación
for
que hace
your comment
respecto a esta cuestión
regarding
de los
regarding
términos,
this
¿verdad? Y de
semantics,
los
regarding the
conceptos
terms and the
que se
concept
utilizan, ¿verdad?
that were
Entonces, más
used.
bien,
Then so
sería pues
it would be just
agradecerle
thank you very
a
much.
ella
It would be
sobre esto, ¿verdad?
in this
Yo
regard.
creo que,
I think
bueno,
that
en mi caso, yo he
in
utilizado
my
mucho
case, I
esto,
have used this a lot,
pensando en términos de
thinking
lo
about
que
thinking in terms of what
viene a darse entre esa
comes
sociedad
to happen
segmentada,
in
¿verdad? La
this
sociedad de
segmented
castas
society,
que
the
ya
case
se le
society,
identifica
case-based
como,
society that is already
como
identified as a
multiétnico, ¿verdad? Entonces,
multi-ethnic.
pues por ahí
So
es un
in
poco
that sense, I believe
que se utiliza en esos
it's a little bit that is being
términos
used
el
in
concepto de etnia,
terms, this
pero
construct of,
definitivamente
but most definitely,
agradecerle, ¿verdad? La
thank you very
observación
much for
que
your
nos hace,
observation
¿verdad? Y
and
el punto pues de las
the point
calidades
of the
y
quality
utilizar el de calidad,
of using
el de casta,
qualities
¿verdad?
of
Entonces,
case.
más bien muchas gracias
So
por
thank you
su
very much. Thank you
observación.
very much for your observation.
Bueno, entonces yo pienso que debo continuar. Bueno, Rina, eso es una muy buena pregunta, pero
That
bueno,
is a
me
good
llevaría
question,
a
but
un discurso de varias horas porque hay
it
que
would take
poner el
me
pedacito
maybe
para cada
hours to
país,
be able
cada
to
región.
address because you
En
would have
realidad hay
to
que decir que
split the
tengo mucho
countries
tiempo
to talk about
de
the
los
different principles,
conocimientos de la
but
academia y la
the
redacción.
knowledge of
Eso es un punto.
academia,
Pero yo pienso
that's
que
one
el gran
point.
problema
But
no
I
es
think the
la
big
falta de
problem
conocimiento.
is the
Son
lack of
intereses
knowledge.
políticos
These are
económicos,
political interests,
depende de
economic
quién
interests,
está participando
and it all
en
depends on who is
hacer las
participating
concepciones de un museo.
on
Es muy bien
doing
claro
the
que los museos
conceptions
se
of a
mejoran
museum.
en
It's
este
very
sentido
clear that
cuando se
museums
incluye las
become better when
comunidades,
you
por
include the
ejemplo,
communities.
afrobritánicas,
For
afrocaribeñas
example,
en la Gran Bretaña y
African,
Francia,
Caribbean,
y la
in Great
situación se
Britain and
empeora cuando
France,
estas comunidades
and the
están excluidas
situation becomes
completamente,
worse
como
when
por
these
ejemplo en España,
communities
en el
have
lugar
been
de
excluded
de la
completely, like
concepción de los
Spain
museos, ¿no? En
and
España, en Portugal es muy, muy claro que
Portugal.
la mayoría de
In
la
Spain and
población
Portugal,
blanca y
most of the
hacia
white
la izquierda moderada no quiere
and
despedirse de la
towards
idea
the
que tuvieron un
moderate
imperio
left,
donde
they
tuvieron una
they don't want to say
esclavitud suave,
part ways with the idea or the
no
conception.
quieren aceptar
They don't want
el
to accept
genocidio de la
that
población indígena
they
americana.
were
No es la
there was
falta
we're talking about genocide
conocimientos, porque hay libros que
during
describen todo eso,
because
no sé, por
there are
ejemplo, el
books
problema es
that
que
actually
los
describe
responsables
this,
políticos no
but
quieren
the
tratar este
political
tema.
responsibles do not want to
Es más
touch
esto.
on this
O, por
topic.
ejemplo, en
It's more
Martinica
about
hay
political. Or in
algunos, es una
Martinique, for
pequeña
example,
isla, pero hay
it's a
historiadoras
small
muy buenas
list,
que
but
han
there are very good
investigado muy
historians that
detalladamente,
have
que han
explained very detailed
publicado fuentes desde
and
la
have
perspectiva de las
published
esclavizadas.
sources
Pero
from the
solamente
perspective,
un museo
but
público
only
con una
one public
consideración muy
museum
particular
with a very
comenzó a
particular
reformar su
conception started
museología en
to
este sentido, de mostrar
reform its
documentos
museology
desde la perspectiva de las
in the
esclavizadas.
concept as to be able
Y
to
el
present the
resto está
perspective of
bajo
the
mando
enslaved
de una
persons,
persona,
and
una
the rest
curadora principal de
is
los museos que viene de la
a
burguesía de color, que de personas que ellos mismos tuvieron esclavizados,
they
no
comes
tienen
from
ningún
people who
interés en
they have no
publicar
interest
esta
whatsoever
historia
in
y
revealing or
dar
disclosing
espacios a,
this story
a los
to
descendientes de los esclavizados
give
rurales.
way to
En Cuba es un
representation of the
problema
enslaved
que la
persons.
clase media
In
blanca no
Cuba,
quiere
the
desprenderse del discurso nacional, que ellos fueron los que han liberado
they
a
have
los
the
africanos
they were
y
actually
que
the
ellos
ones
han
that they liberated
colonizado
the
la
African
India, no quieren
descendants, and they
admitir
were
que en
actually
verdad
they don't
los
want to
afrocubanos
admit
han
that the
demandado la
African
independencia
Cuban
casi
have
60
demanded
años antes de
independence
la clase
6 years before the leading white class. It's a political issue that has an incidence in general society and mostly museums, but mostly it's just a political issue. But we would have to address each country separately. And the other question, we know that the images of caste come from a very long-standing story of perception, but it's very difficult now because we would have to examine painting per painting, but there are very many paintings in which people, particularly that are classified as black caste or mulattoes or zambos, are shown in a very negative light. They appear as thieves. For example, is the black woman hitting their white husband. So usually the social order is inverted. Usually it is the white person that is represented in a more favorable light. And that goes against mixed race marriages. When they show this type of paintings, of course, in the Museum of America show that to say, well, there was a variety of cases, but we had to explain that what's presented in these pages is not it's not a reality. It's not like the black woman would hit on her white husband, because it produces an ethnic society. If not explained, it's very, very dangerous, because there are always some images that have a very strong repercussion in the and that's always stronger than whatever words we can use, without any explanation, without a way of just providing like it's one racist image is way stronger than 50 words. That's why I believe that we need to think about how you can find how can you counter the strength of the racist paintings, for example. So there's an increase in this, but we have to think a lot about which images are shown, and it's a way of explaining and providing context. I believe that people in France are going to criticize me, that at least it needs to make some sense, because there is a lot of persons that are Afro-descendants, that lawyers, athletes, that contradict this image of the African person in an inferior level with there are, of course, political figures and thinkers that are of African descent. So that will be one idea, of course. I don't want to convey the wrong message. Thank you very much. We have 3 more questions, and with that, we would be adjourning the session. So I'm going to read the 2 that we have, and then I'm going to give the consensus.
¿Con qué clase de información se cuenta confirmada para afirmar la procedencia de los Barahona y los Maroto en
What kind of
relación
information do we have to confirm that the Barahona and the Maroto regarding the African, the slave Africans, that they come from them? And Maricela is also asking, for Dr. Melendez, in your experience, which have been the main changes, theoretical and methodological changes, in the study of the African in the province of Costa Rica and Central America? And I give the floor to Professor Cáceres also. It's a shame because we have two more presentations. I had comments and questions for Maria de Los Ángeles and for the always very captivating because of the questions that are generated by Mauricio Melendez. In the case, a very punctual question, Dr. Acuña. Do we know how this population comes to this region? That is in the north of Costa Rica. Is that a product of a mobilization because of the migrations? Is there some sort of migration that comes from Cartago, from Rivas, or is there, and that is the question that everybody poses, was there a settlement present of Africanized enslaved Africans like to produce communities of the size that you have? Having read your studies, it seems that there's sort of like a migration that took place that went to this region. And with Mr. Mauricio, later I'll make the question because if not, we will not be able to do it in time.
Le damos la palabra a la doctora Acuña.
So we give the floor to Dr. Acuña and later to Ms. Melendez, to Master Melendez. Thank you very much for the questions. Dr. Cáceres. I would say, according to what has been made, the research that made by other colleagues, and what I have researched, that they were going to come here mainly because of migrating movements. And they are going towards that in the beginning, in this part of the northern Pacific of Costa Rica. It is mainly going to be coming from the side of Nicaragua. So that link that there is between Rivas, Nicoya, and the northern Pacific of Costa Rica. So there are many that are going to come that way, especially the people that are going to work in the cattle farms. And in the case of Costa Rica, we do have records that there are many individuals, Spanish individuals, who are the owners of the farms, but they are absent. They are absent from those farms. And there they have their farmers, their foremen, and so forth, and mayorales who can be Spaniards, who can be indigenous, or they could be Afro-descendants. And there is also a migration in the 18th century because there is a growth of the population that is very important, especially of that mixed breed population of the pro-mestizo, of the Afro-descendants, and well, these people, the way they move to the western part of the Central Valley, they are also going to move to the northern Pacific because we even find tributary indigenous working in those regions when supposedly the legislation says that the tributaries are not taken out of their towns. And in the documentation, there they are. But that there is a settlement, let's say sufficiently large, to see if there's a growth in this population. I have not seen it. Neither is it perceived in the communication that there might be some sort of justification for this. So I would say that there is no evidence to prove that. Thank you very much for clarifying that. Well, regarding this, the specific question about the Barahona, which is valid for all the families that are of with origin from enslaved people. It is a great advantage for a genealogist at that time in being considered, and that's that there is many details from all the way from physical descriptions, sometimes maybe questions that are more moral than the Spaniards themselves. So we have a lot of information, and in the case of being able to determine that the Barahona, the Maroto, and others like Maria Capitana, and others that we are trying to clarify this, the advantage is that the governor, Grandi Valdin, later sells these people, and precisely they generate a protocol, a document where we can track down that they had been among those 21 slaves that Grandi Valdin kept as salaries, past due salaries. And then what do we have? Well, precisely Teresa Barahona was bought by Antonio Soto Barahona. When he dies, there's a mortuary trial taking place, very detailed, in which the slaves are described physically by age and the children that they have. So you can create genealogies of the slaves, and sometimes when they have been released, this generates a lot of paradox, the matter of caste, because there were slaves that were so successful in what they learned that it generates for them a wealth that a poor Spaniard doesn't have. So you might have a mulatto with black slaves, Africans that have been liberated, that is more successful generating money than a Spaniard. So of course, there are then matrimonial relationships that are accepted because that person of African origin has an economic position that is better than a poor Spaniard. And there are some poor Spaniards that are not concerned about this. Obviously, the elites didn't come to that of the matrimony, but although the case that is cited by María about Dolores Campos, that she is eradicated to the zone of Bagaces, and they lived, and the gentleman was a Spaniard and from the Spanish elite who wanted to marry that slave. He was not able to do so because the authorities, the ecclesiastic authorities, thought that it was way too drastic to have a slave mulatto marrying a Spaniard. The thing is that all this, to be able to determine the origins of the enslaved people, can be done thanks to all those documents like letters, testaments, mortuaries, trials like the ones that were carried out by Diego de la Vega Hernandez. So you can track down and see where those slaves come from. Other times, it is not possible. It's simply not possible. In my case, in my personal case, I have several mulattoes as antecedents. I don't know their origin, if they are Spanish or African. Why? Because sometimes the Spanish had children with their slaves or free slave mulattoes, but they didn't recognize that. They had children with them. Why? Because they were married or they were priests or something, and they didn't want to have that exposed. That's what happens in very much in Latin America, that we are not able to determine where our ancestors come from. And about the genealogical side, let me talk about this. First of all, there is a lot of prejudice towards the African, prejudice towards the indigenous. What was put in the pyramid base or the poor, there will always be prejudice in each one of the stages. And it turns out that since 1950 and maybe before that, Monsignor Seniabra wrote the genealogies of Cartago, where he established, and he said, which were the descendants of Indians, African slaves, of poor Spaniards, and so forth. There was an inclusive genealogy. Unfortunately, in Costa Rica, not many followed his steps. It was only until the 1990s, with the appearance of the Association of Genealogy of Costa Rica, they did a review, and they started somehow to start looking at those that had been left behind. So in that methodology, precisely, that's the genealogy that is used by historians. All the documents that allow us to rebuild that family history, not for everybody, but at least for many. And sometimes we can follow track of hundreds of years that can take us to our African ancestors. And nowadays, there's not that much, and at least in the 1990s, I am a descendant of a slave. They will look, open their eyes and not believe it, and they want to leave. Nowadays, they say this is very interesting. Do you know something about the history of this person? There's a change now. At least in Costa Rica, people want to know their heritage. I think that Latin America in general is still in a toddler stage. This of tracking down and looking for an African in the ancestry tree, they don't like it. Many people don't like it yet. But that's what we're facing right now. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Melendez. Thanks to all the panel members, Dr. Schneider, Dr. Cunha Melendez, for these very, very interesting presentations that you have made us this morning or evening, depending on where you are. We are going to go to a break now of maybe some 30 minutes, and we will come back with the next roundtable, the roundtable number 3, that would be regarding Indigenous and Africans in times of conquer. In this roundtable, we invite you to accompany us also. In this table, we're going to have roundtable. We're going to have Robinson and Herrera and Professor Lisa Payne, both of them professors from universities. And later on, we will have the roundtable number 4 regarding life stories in a slaving community to close the day with presentations. So we have a very extensive program and a very good program. So we hope that you will continue on accompanying us. We thank you once again. We thank all the people that have accompanied us on the networks, and to all of you who have accompanied us here who are present. Thank you very much, and we will meet again in some 30 minutes. Please, we will be back at that time. Thank you.